Okay, so in my previous video that I posted, I asked you guys to pretty much send me any questions that you had related to psychedelia or myself as a person or just whatever else. I ended up getting a pretty overwhelming amount of questions. It ended up being around over 300, so we've organized them into a spreadsheet and we're just going to go through them one by one now. A lot of the questions were pretty similar, so I've merged them in. I'll give people credit via flashing up the comments on the screen, and just keep in mind that my only legitimate field of expertise is the documentation and classification of altered states of consciousness, particularly as it pertains to psychedelics. So if I ever diverge off that particular topic, I may be wrong, disregard everything I say, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. Do you do any research on psychedelics outside of YouTube, either for a job or volunteer work?
Yeah, so YouTube is actually not my main source of income. It's more of a side thing, at least financially, although I am quite passionate about it. I work for a biotech research startup company called Mindstate Design Labs. It was founded by a close friend of Alex Shulgin, and within that company, I work as a project manager. My position is to create an academically rigorous version of the subjective effect index that can be found on effectindex.com, and we are trying to correlate subjective effect outcomes with receptor affinities of specific psychedelic compounds in order to further the field of psychedelic therapy.
How did you get into psychedelic research from the moment it sparked your interest to how you actually entered the field?
I originally got into psychedelic research in a very amateur sense at the age of 17 when I started using psychedelics, and I suddenly realized that there was no formal classification for the subjective effects that they induce available online, at least not to the standards that I hoped. So I started a project called the Subjective Effect Index, originally hosted on a blog called Disregard Everything I Say. Eventually the Subjective Effect Index outgrew a Tumblr blog, but gained a lot of traction, so I founded Psychonaut Wiki, which became one of the leading drug information resource websites on the internet. I'm not involved in it anymore. Eventually moved over to Effect Index, which is a website that tries to pioneer this idea of formalized subjective effect documentation. Did that for a long time, worked menial, unrelated jobs for most of that, and eventually the field of psychedelic research became capitalism approved, and I was immediately picked up by a psychedelic research company. And now I work in this field professionally as my actual career.
Are you able to talk about any of the projects going on at Mindstate Design Labs?
I can't talk about everything due to NDAs, but I can talk about a fair amount of it. I already brushed over it a moment ago. The main thing that I've been doing is trying to create a much more academically rigorous version of the subjective effect index. And the way in which I have been doing that is by spending the last year or so doing a large-scale literature review on all pre-existing classification systems for altered states of consciousness in existence. So this includes things like psychometric scales that are factor analysis validated and used in various studies. For example, there's the 11-dimensional altered states of consciousness scale, the phenomenology of consciousness in Venturi, the mystical experience questionnaire, MEQ30, I'm a fan of that one. A bunch of other psychometric scales, but then there's also more informal classification systems, which are more akin to my own version of the subjective effect index, in that they were just created by people who are passionate about the psychedelic experience or altered states of consciousness in general. And those include the Subjective Effect Index, Antipodes of the Mind by Benny Shannon, which is essentially a subjective effect index for ayahuasca. I'm a big fan of that book. The DMT Nexus's Hyperspace Lexicon, Timothy Leary's 6 Levels of Psychedelic Experience. Wait, is it 8? I think it might be 8 levels. I can't even remember off the top of my head. The Shulgin Rating Scale, and a number of other ones. So I've taken all of those different classification systems, I've broken them down into their constituent labels, and I've interconverted the terms that refer to each altered state of consciousness and merged them all into one larger classification system, which has a completely different organizational structure to that of the Subjective Effect Index and consists of around 500 labels. I can't talk about it in too much detail, but we are then taking that classification system and using it to label trip reports for psychoactive substances that have been bioassayed. So we know their specific receptor affinities, mostly based on a study done by one of the founders of the company, Tom Ray. And in doing that, we are hoping to create a data set that can statistically correlate subjective effect outcomes with receptor affinities in the brain and improve our understanding of how these altered states of consciousness work.
How is your research funded? This is referring to your professional work, not YouTube. So I guess the funding of Mind State Design Labs.
It's a startup company, but it's also a Y Combinator startup company, which is a pretty big name in the startup world. Not that I'd heard of them before I started this job, and pretty much venture capitalists. I think during the first funding round, they raised around $11 million, and that number continues to rise as time goes on.
Did you go to university, and what are your thoughts on it?
I did not go to university. I did very poorly in school. The secondary school I went to in the UK was so bad that they knocked it down and rebuilt it into an academy the year after I left, and most of the kids failed. But even if it was a good school, I was pretty mentally unstable growing up, so I probably wouldn't have done great anyway. I went to college, which is basically just high school in America, and kind of got through that, but then I promptly discovered psychedelics at the age of 17 and realized that I could go to university, but that there was no relevant field for what I wanted to study, which was subjective effect documentation. So I kind of just decided that I was going to work whatever jobs I could find while doing this as a passion project on the side, and maybe it would eventually work out, which it did. So I'm glad I made that choice, even if it took around 10 years to eventually pay off.
Yeah. How can one engage and contribute to the end of the stigma regarding psychedelics?
This one is really difficult, actually. I think you kind of just need to tailor how you talk about psychedelics to the people that you were talking to. Not to the extent that you are lying, but you kind of need to understand where they are coming from. So if you're talking to an overly conservative person, you might want to emphasize the therapeutic benefits, or maybe how MDMA is being studied to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. Conservatives love veterans. If you have new agey, wooey spiritual beliefs about these kinds of things, you might want to hide your power level on that one when talking to people who aren't into that sort of thing. Ultimately, you can't really change people's minds. All you can do is just plant little seeds that might eventually change their perspective later on down the line.
Yeah. What would you recommend to someone who's looking to start a career in psychedelics?
Okay, so again, this one is incredibly difficult for me because the particular path that I took into becoming a professional psychedelic researcher is very specific to me. I can't tell people to go back in time and found the subjective effect index in 2011, because that's kind of already done. Most of the people that I meet that work in this field did go to university and generally studied something related to chemistry or neuroscience or psychology or psychopharmacology. The other people that I meet that work full-time in this field are generally therapists and then also venture capitalist type people, and I can't really comment on what their path in life was to get to those positions. All I can really say is how I ended up where I am.
What do you think are main factors and common mistakes in causing bad trips?
Okay, so the main factors are probably jumping in the deep end before you can swim, i.e. taking an amount that is far higher than you are going to be accustomed to. I would always recommend that people start at very low doses and work their way up incrementally as they feel comfortable. The other main factor is set and setting. So are you tripping in an appropriate environment? Are you doing it in a public, hectic place, perhaps surrounded by drunk people or people that you just probably aren't going to want to be around in such a vulnerable state? And are you in a good place mentally? So if you're taking a psychedelic while you're incredibly unstable, then it's more likely to result in a negative experience. Not having a trip sitter for beginners, I think, is a big one. I don't think a trip sitter is absolutely necessary, but in the beginning, you're probably going to want one. And I think those are the most common mistakes.
When it comes to main factors, I think that definitely the way that someone's brain is wired in terms of how it processes psychedelics, or being more prone to psychosis, for example, also a pretty main factor.
Yeah, there's a lot of individual variation in how likely people are to be able to handle these kinds of experiences, and while it is possible to make an educated guess on how somebody might respond to a psychedelic if you know them very well and you're also a very experienced user of psychedelics, it's kind of impossible to guess purely for yourself, which, again, I guess is why I would recommend starting at low levels and working your way up incrementally.
Yeah, for a person who habitually, for reasons of personality or past trauma or anything, has a need to have control of a situation, they would need to demonstrate a lot more, or like exercise a lot more care when it comes to getting into tripping, I think.
Yeah, control freaks or just people who are afraid of losing control are much more prone to having anxiety attacks, especially at the higher levels when you start going through ego dissolution.
Yeah. Just like being able to just accept it as it happens.
Mm-hmm.
What would you make of almost always having a bad trip despite set and setting?
I mean, maybe psychedelics just aren't for you?
This person clarifies that they don't believe in bad trips, just necessary experiences.
Bad trips are a real thing. Bad trips can be educational. Some of my most beneficial trips have been unpleasant experiences, but I've had plenty of experiences that have just been unpleasant. They have been a result of poor mental health or poor decision-making processes before going into the experience, but some experiences are just bad, and I don't think we should sugarcoat it. If you are only having negative psychedelic experiences, I would recommend drastically lowering the dosage and working your way back up again over time, or consider taking a break. You can always trip at a later stage in your life. You don't have to trip right now. It's not necessary if you don't want to. And maybe psychedelics just aren't for you. That's totally fine. They're definitely not for everyone.
Yeah, I remember reading about, there's like a whole portion of the population where if they get really into meditation, that it can cause like mental breaks. Like some people's brains aren't really meant for being put in certain situations.
Yeah.
Can you share some of your bad trips?
The worst trip that I ever had is an experience I've recounted before on stream. I hallucinated that I was in my hometown, naked, being arrested by the police, while all of my friends and family stood and laughed and mocked me over and over and over again for an eternity. And eventually I came to, and I was fully clothed in a bedroom in a completely different country.
I love it when things work out.
Yeah, it worked out in the end. I wasn't having a great time during that period of my life, and I think that's why I had such a bad trip.
Do you think that it taught you anything about feelings of shame that you have?
Not really. It was just an unpleasant experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it taught me to be a bit more careful, but not much else. Not every bad trip is going to give you some sort of profound lesson.
Yeah. Do you think that people get more bad trips on mushrooms or LSD?
So this really varies from individual to individual. We've actually ran some polls on both my YouTube channel and my subreddit REUPlocations, and also on Twitter. And when merging all that data, it was asking specifically about anxiety. I'm probably going to do some more about challenging experiences or just bad trips more generally. It seems to be pretty polarized, and that's what I've noticed in real life, that many people respond better to mushrooms or LSD, presumably based on personal preferences, neurochemistry, personality, things like that.
Yeah, which one's your favorite, actually?
It's gone back and forth at different points in my life. I had a period where I really disliked LSD because it would cause me immense feelings of physical anxiety, but mushrooms are fine. And now I prefer LSD because mushrooms induce more feelings of grief. So I'd say that right now, at this point in my life, I'm a bigger fan of LSD, and overall, I have a lot more experience with LSD than I do mushrooms.
You kind of figured it'd be LSD, but...
Yeah, I've used LSD much more over the years.
Is there a feel-bad molecule? Basically, could I take anti-dopamine and feel horrible?
So if you took anti-dopamine, that would basically just be an antipsychotic, since those are dopamine antagonists. They literally block dopamine, also serotonin, noradrenaline, things like that. And those aren't feel bad molecules. They basically just block your ability to think or feel emotions and make you pass out and feel like a zombie. In terms of feel bad molecules in the way that I assume you meant it, though, I would say probably just anticholinergic, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, deliriants such as diphenhydramine and datura, because those are incredibly dysphoric and make you feel extremely physically ill, horrible physical side effects, not a great time, no recreational value, at least for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, on a related note, any chance you could go into detail about the Deliriant PSA?
So in the Deliriant PSA, I made a replication compilations of Deliriants, and I put text at the beginning saying, out of all the psychoactive compounds that I have tried, Deliriants are the only class of compound that left me with permanent physical damage. And it did the same thing to my friend. What it did was it just completely screwed up our bladder for a few years. We just needed to pee all the time, and both of us had to go to the doctors for it. It was really bad, and it took a long time to recover, and no other class of psychoactive substance has damaged an organ for me, and I've tried a lot of different classes.
What are your experiences with Deliriants?
My experiences with Deliriants, I haven't done them in many years, and I do not intend to use them again because there's no value in it for me. They're just horrible. They are a pretty big curiosity, though, and they're just generally very interesting. I first tried DPH at a Deliriant dose probably around the age of 18. I hallucinated my friends being in the room talking with me. I hallucinated a shadowy figure wearing a bowling hat, and I didn't think anything of it, but then years later I see all these Hatman references, and I think, did I just see British Hatman? Because I was living in the UK at the time. That was my first DPH trip, and I realized it just made me feel so horribly ill. For example, my mouth would get so dry that I couldn't swallow, and I just was vomiting and very nauseous, and my whole body ached and hurt. So I would start combining it with... There's no way this video is going to get monetized. I would start combining it with DXM to offset the negative physical side effects, because DSM is a dissociative, and dissociatives are anesthetics, and it works quite effectively. But the problem was, me and my friend who were trying to document the subjective effects at the time, we were very young, this was extremely stupid, would experience amnesia, so we would have to do it again because we were trying to document the subjective effects aside from amnesia, and we kept taking what we were calling brain shifts. Eventually it resulted in medical harm. Oh, I had a period later on in my life where I would find datura plants growing around town, and I would pick the flowers and dry them out and smoke them. And it didn't induce any deliriant effects. I couldn't get it to be strong enough to do that. It would just be a relaxing stoning effect like weed. So I was just using it on a daily basis, and eventually I started to notice that while I was completely sober, I would see shadow people or just figures and things like that in the corner of my eye, and I would look, and there'll be nothing there. So I thought, it's probably time to stop smoking datura on a daily basis, and I haven't smoked it since.
You know, I was thinking about trying DPH for just one time for working on a Shadow People Hatman video, but you really provide a really good reason to not do that.
There's no need.
Yeah, it just sounds miserable.
There's plenty of people out there doing deliriants. I've already documented the subjective effects, so
yeah,
I'm not going back in.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, you should not.
No, I have no intention of doing so.
There's a lot of talk regarding psychedelics. Are you planning to do a video regarding deliriants and the visuals/experiences on deliriants?
Yes, I would like to do that. It's not near the top of my to-do list, since I think people are mostly following me for content related to psychedelics. A lot of people ask me to make dissociative and salvia videos as well. I want to cover pretty much everything that's been covered in the Subjective Effect Index, everything that's been covered on Psychonaut Wiki that I've written personally, and I'll get around to it eventually. It might happen faster than a dissociative video at this rate because there's a ton of replications for it.
Yeah, we are still wanting to do something about Shadow People or the Hatman for a video essay. And we would touch on deliriants for that, though it wouldn't be levels of the deliriant experience by any means.
I'm not sure that the deliriant experience can be broken down into levels quite as cleanly as psychedelics and dissociatives can. Yeah,
but even the Shadow People one I don't think is really at the top of our list right now.
Yeah. I suppose I do have old articles on Disregard Everything I Say breaking deliriums down into their subjective effect components, so I could probably just repurpose that into a video quite easily. Yeah, we'll get around to it.
Hey Josie, do you know if there is any uses, shamanic or spiritual, of deliriance in some cultures or tribes?
As far as I am aware, there are a lot of traditional uses of datura plants in traditional shamanic uses. I know that some tribes even combine it with their ayahuasca. There's some interesting trip report accounts of it in one of my favorite books, Antipodes of the Mind. It's definitely a thing. I think there are traditional uses of it in European culture as well, but I cannot remember anything specific related to that. But it grows on every continent and has been incorporated into a lot of traditional uses, yeah.
What are your thoughts of the Hat Man entity that is seen in sleep paralysis episodes and deliriant trips, and do you think it has any correlation with DMT entities?
Just wondering what they mean by the specific word correlation. I assume just relation? Yeah, so the Hat Man is essentially a shadow person that pops up under the influence of deliriance and during sleep paralysis, and as far as I can tell, he seems to just be a shadow person with a specific change in its silhouette, as in the addition of a hat, which I think is quite a simplistic addition to add to a shadow person, so it makes sense that pops up a lot. But then also, because people encounter that quite a lot, it kind of mimetically propagates throughout the collective subconscious, which makes the Hat Man show up even more. It's a sort of self-fueling process. And in regards to whether or not it's related to DMT entities, I think that people or entities or shadow people or dream characters are largely the result of similar neurological processes that behave differently in different circumstances. So I would say that, yeah, the Hat Man is related to DMT entities.
And for the record, another relation between them is that we think that they are both products of the human mind that is experiencing them and not something that exists in the outside world as far as we understand it.
I don't think Hat Man is out there chilling somewhere. I think he's purely a product of people's imagination.
Well, the Hat Man community would be so upset by this.
They'll be fine.
I want to see the Hat Man. How do you suggest I proceed?
I would suggest that you do not proceed.
Don't proceed.
But if you were to proceed, hypothetically speaking, in Minecraft...
We're really not trying to be monetized, are we? Don't do it, kids. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. If I wanted to meet the Hat Man, I would probably ingest 700 and... Okay, I would...
First, if I recall correctly, first you would create a shrine to the Hat Man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then I would pray to the Hat Man.
Pray to the Hat Man.
Then I would ingest deliriums and probably watch that documentary about the Hat Man. And I think that would do it.
Yeah. At least, bring up the odds significantly.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. What's the difference between depersonalization and dissociation?
I would say that depersonalization falls under the umbrella term of dissociation. There are lots of different types of dissociation. There's depersonalization, where you feel that you don't have a sense of self. There's derealization, where you feel that the things around you aren't real. There's sensory dissociation, where you become increasingly disconnected from your senses and can eventually have out-of-body experiences and things like that. There's cognitive dissociation, where you can feel more separated from your thoughts or your actions, and I think that those are all different aspects of the general term dissociation.
Yeah, and when dissociatives are used for therapy, it's often because it has an emotional dissociation, where one can still think about their emotions without actually experiencing those emotions in the moment, which allows processing that you can't necessarily do while you're actively experiencing difficult emotions.
Yeah, I find that really useful.
What do you think of dissociatives?
I'm a big fan of dissociatives. In many ways, I prefer them to psychedelics these days because they're a lot more chill. And I find that for me, while they don't have the potential to be as therapeutic as a psychedelic possibly can, psychedelics, for me personally, are a lot more hit and miss. They can be extremely therapeutic, or they can be just a little bit therapeutic, whereas deliriants are pretty therapeutic every single time. And They also reduce anxiety while you're on them. So going through ego disillusion under the influence of a dissociative is incredibly relaxing, whereas going through ego disillusion under the influence of a psychedelic generally is much less relaxing, depending on the circumstances. And I think that they kind of exist, the two classes of compound kind of exist in a sort of yin-yang. Psychedelics make your brain more interconnected, and dissociatives make your brain more disconnected, as in they literally block electrical signals between neurons by being a glutamate antagonist, which is the neurotransmitter that helps carry electrical signals. I think they're an entire other world from psychedelics, and they have just as much potential as psychedelics as well.
The most extreme mystical experiences I've had was on a mixture of dissociative and psychedelic.
Yeah, they combine very well.
Yeah.
I think dissociatives take the edge off of psychedelics.
Yeah. Will you make a video about the levels of the dissociative experience?
Yes, so I've already written an article which breaks down the dissociative experience into 6 or 7 levels, and I have it all already mapped out and the individual subjective effect components mapped out. The biggest limiting factor for making a video about dissociatives right now is that there are a million different psychedelic replications within the replication community, and there are very few dissociative replications. So I don't have enough replications of, say, the K-hole to fill up a video in a way that makes it visually engaging. I think they would largely have to be made specifically for the video, probably by hypnagogists, and that is the primary limiting factor. If I had enough replications for it, I would jump into it right now.
Yeah, we'd definitely be interested.
But we are going to get around to that. I think that one's important.
What is your opinion on DXM?
I love DXM. I'm a huge DXM fan. It's one of my favorites. It induces profound spiritual and mystical experiences for me at high enough doses. I've had problems with being addicted to it in the past. Not so much these days, although it is still one of my favorites.
Yeah, you weren't able to use it for a while, right?
Yeah, I used it too much over a period of a year or two, and I started getting impending senses of doom during the come down. So I took a break for a couple of years and then revisited it, and it seems to be fine now, but I'm no longer abusing it. The problem with DXM is that it's incredibly hit and miss. A huge portion of the population literally don't have the enzymes to metabolize it, so they get horrible side effects, and it lasts about 2 days for them. But if you're one of the people that responds well to DXM, then it's great, and I would recommend it. It's maybe 2/3 dissociative and 1/3 psychedelic. I find that the first half of the trip is more dissociative, and then it gradually becomes more psychedelic as you get to the end of the trip. And I've just had so many experiences on DXM where I'm holding, completely disconnected from my body, gently floating through the dextroverse, and I'm just in awe at how profound and vast and beautiful the hallucinations are. And there's a real sense of, yes, this is home, for better or worse.
Well, on the other hand, I don't get nearly as much nausea as most people do, but it never turns into anything of significance. I just find it, just kind of dissociating, and there's not much there for me, honestly.
Yeah, a lot of people find it to be bland. It seems to really vary from person to person. I'm a DXM person, though.
What are your thoughts on permatolerance with dissociatives?
So I can't really comment on what the neurological mechanisms behind this might be. I've noticed that permatolerance can arise with other substances, and to some extent there is a psychological aspect to it. So, for example, with the euphoria that people experience on opioids when they are nodding out, they can actually get used to that intensity of euphoria and positive emotion to such an extent that it's just not exciting to them anymore. They kind of build up a psychological tolerance. On the other hand, there does seem to be this sort of mental blockage that can build up over time with certain substances, and it hasn't been studied, and I can't really comment on what might cause that. All I can really suggest is taking a long break.
In how many fields of science would a DMT study fall into? Psychology, chemistry, quantum physics, maybe?
I can't think of any DMT studies that fall under quantum physics.
I guess maybe
I
this
think-
has a bit of a misconception about what a study is. You know, like there can be interdisciplinary studies, but usually individual studies are about pretty specific.
Yeah, neuropsychopharmacology or psychology, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like even one on like psychology and even sociology, I think would be really interesting to study like the way that DMT can affect like groups of people and stuff.
Yeah, all of the studies that I've seen seem to just fall under psychopharmacology or maybe psychiatry or something.
Political science.
Yeah, I don't
There
see
could
that. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, but like you know what I'm saying. There's a lot of different directions from which to study DMT and other compounds.
Yeah, definitely.
What is your take on the DMT that is produced inside our brain when it dies?
To my understanding, this is a thing that was originally propagated by Rick Strassman in his book DMT, The Spirit Molecule, and it was purely speculation on his end. If you read the book, it's just his speculation. He's actually a friend of the guy who founded the company that I work for, and there's no scientific evidence for it. DMT is definitely present in plants and mammals. I'm not sure if it's been 100% confirmed to be present in humans, but it probably is, because it just seems to be in lots of plants and mammals, probably as some sort of...
Yeah, it has been.
Has it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It hasn't actually been found, like, if I recall correctly, I heard about, at the time that I was seeing something, that it had been found in, like, lung tissue, but had not been specifically found in the human brain because of how it degrades, probably.
I also read a study in which they would kill a rat and measure the neurotransmitters that flooded into its brain, and DMT was present, but so was everything else. It seems that the brain will just flood itself with all of the neurotransmitters, and definitely not DMT specifically. There's also no evidence that DMT is released when you're dreaming, when you're born, when you're dying, as we were saying, or anything like that. It seems to just be purely speculation that is repeated as fact, even though there's no evidence for it, and there's actually some evidence against it.
Yeah, when we were working on the DMT video, I briefly looked at through the SED community, a bit of an academic slap fight of people saying, oh, here's the DMT in the brain doing this, and the other one the other one showing, actually it doesn't seem to be produced in the pineal gland. About this question, there's a follow-up from the same questioner. Mm-hmm. Do you believe the research? How do you think this is related to religion? There's nothing really to add when it comes to that, I think.
Yeah, I don't think so.
What was your first experience with DMT like?
Okay, so my first DMT trip, I smoked it in my bedroom. I could not remember how much. I would guess that it was around 60 mg. I broke through, and I was not in hyperspace. I was standing in a park in central London next to the River Thames, which was near the office that I was working in at the time. And the entity that I met was a middle-aged biker, probably about 6 foot tall. I remember having a perfectly pleasant conversation with him that was nothing out of the ordinary. And then at some point, I flew up over the city of London and encountered a giant pink goddess face in the sky, and she beamed some profound, incoherent message to me that probably had no actual real content to it. And I promptly came down, was slammed back into my bedroom in an entirely different city, and was just flooded with euphoria and awe at what I had experienced. And that was my first DMT trip.
Can you elaborate the idea that experiences like DMT breakthroughs are occurring just in your mind and are not part of reality or some other realities?
When I first started using DMT at a younger age, I was very agnostic about DMT hyperspace being, I don't know, a higher dimension or a parallel universe or something like that. In fact, I was hopeful that that was the case. But the more I explored it and the more my friends explored it, it became quite apparent that it was just the psychedelic equivalent of a dream state. You can even use lucid dreaming techniques within the DMT space, and they apply just the same. And the more I've explored psychedelics in general, the more I have seen that it's essentially just a computer simulation generated by the brain and there's no real reason to believe that it's occurring outside of it. I think there would need to be some sort of extraordinary evidence that it was. It would be really cool if it was, but I don't think that's the case. And to me, that does not diminish the experience at all. And I would advise against people underestimating what the human brain is capable of generating. It's the most powerful known system in the entire universe, and it can quite easily generate incomprehensibly beautiful and ineffable experiences under the right circumstances. It does not need to be occurring elsewhere. And this is just my personal opinion. There are very smart people who I respect that believe differently, and I am happy to agree to disagree. So, yeah.
But basically, like, give yourself some credit. Your brain can do some pretty cool things.
Yeah. And I don't want to get in an argument over it. It's just my personal opinion.
Yeah. And DMT vape is 100% safe?
Nothing is 100% safe.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I mean, if you have asthma, I could see the vapor causing an asthma attack or something, maybe.
Yeah. Where did you get this then in DMT vape?
Maybe if you're prone to psychosis or schizophrenia, it could trigger some sort of break. If you jump into the deep end before you could swim, you could get some kind of a trauma. I think it's pretty safe. I'd say it's
safer than alcohol.
It's safer than alcohol, but it's not 100% safe. I struggle to think of something that is 100% safe.
Yeah. Come on. Can we overdose on DMT?
Yes. I have known people who have done too much DMT and had a traumatic experience as a result. It doesn't physically harm you, but it could psychologically harm you.
Yeah, I know someone who took, I think 2 years to feel okay again.
We're thinking of the same person, yeah.
And that's somebody who still really believes in DMT therapy, still does DMT themselves, and like just because they had that experience doesn't mean that they are anti-DMT. They just know that you can overdose on DMT.
Yeah, he had too intense of an experience before he was ready, and it did sound like an extremely intense experience.
Yeah. Are there dream entities?
Yes. I mean, people meet characters and entities in their dreams all the time, probably in most of their dreams. If you meet an old friend from high school in a dream, that was a dream entity, usually referred to by the lucid dreaming community as a dream character. And they have their own agency and personality, and you can interact with them in similar ways to that of a DMT entity. They just don't have that hyperspatial aesthetic because they're not comprised of incomprehensibly complex psychedelic geometry. And
also, they have a tendency to look and behave and feel different because your brain is sober at the time.
Yeah, and in that state, the brain seems to choose entities based on your memories of people that you knew in real life or things that are more realistic to an experience you would actually have, rather than trying to create something entirely new by mixing and matching various concepts.
Have you ever seen entities on LSD or shrooms, and how are they different from the ones you see on DMT?
I haven't seen entities on LSD and shrooms specifically, but I've seen a lot of entities on 2CE and 2CP and salvia, 4-HOMET. I think they can occur on pretty much any psychedelic at appropriately high doses. LSD and shrooms tend to consist more of geometric hallucinations rather than entities for me at very high doses, but they can happen on any psychedelic. It's not a thing that is specific to DMT, it's more that DMT can take you to higher places more conveniently because it's smokable.
To what degree do you think that people's DMT experiences with entities, etc., is affected by what they had previously read or heard about other people's experiences? Mimetic quality of entities.
I mean, okay, so this one is tricky to say because it's a really difficult thing to study, but I would guess greatly. I've heard plenty of friends describe seeing cartoon characters or fictional characters from media in DMT. I had a friend who had an Adventure Time themed hallucination on DMT that was clearly influenced by his culture, but at the same time, I do think that a lot of these entities are more innate. For example, insectoid-related entities, I could easily see the concept of insects or serpents or animals just sort of being embedded in the subconscious from birth. But generally, it's impossible to say.
Do psychedelic entities have a self? Could they continue? They seem to have one, yet they talk a lot of shit about how our illusion of self is trash. They seem to be separate from the rest of their existence, but also a part of it.
I think the psychedelic entities probably do have their own fleeting and temporary conscious perspective or agency, and I think the same applies to dream characters. The brain is quite capable of rendering multiple conscious agents at once. This happens under the influence of DMT. It can happen with people that have DID, dissociative identity disorder. It can happen with tulpas. It can happen with dream characters. And I think the same neurological process that generates your own sense of self and agency probably also generates the entity's sense of self and agency.
If people from different cultures experience similar entities on DMT, why is that not an evidence to their existence?
That's a good question. I don't really think that people experiencing similar entities would be a proof of their existence. So, for example, lots of people see elves. There seems to be this sort of common cultural conception of small beings or spirits that pervades various cultures. I guess it's similar to dragons, although people don't really hallucinate dragons. People commonly see insectoids, and insects are just sort of a universal cultural concept. Same with animals and beings and goddesses. I think that these are just things that are in our collective cultural subconscious, and that's why they occur for people. We also all have similarly structured brains. Obviously, there's some amount of variance, but it makes sense to me that if lots of different human brains all take the same substance, that they would have somewhat similar experiences. I think it would be a lot crazier if we all had completely different experiences.
Yeah, there does seem to be some evidence that people kind of innately, regardless of culture, have certain visual things that they are very much attuned to. I remember seeing a study about where they were studying what kinds of shapes people are most able to recognize in their periphery. And they found that the number one across the world was spiders.
That probably...
Humans are made to be able to see spiders in their periphery.
That makes perfect sense, and probably explains why so many people hallucinate spiders while they're under the influence of deliriums. People commonly see snakes under the influence of DMT or psychedelics in general, and I imagine that snakes are embedded within our brain from birth. There's a kind of silly example where if you throw a cucumber on the ground, cats are often afraid of it because they think it's a snake, even if they've never seen a snake before. So if that concept is embedded within a cat's subconscious, I see no reason why it couldn't be embedded within a human's subconscious.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like evolutionary memory, basically. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the coincidences that occur on DMT trips with regard to encounters with insectoid entities, mainly the mantis?
I think it makes a lot of sense that people experience insect entities while under the influence of DMT, because as I said in the previous answer to the previous question, insects are just a very prominent concept within the human mind, and the brain recognizes human faces very well. If you've ever seen a mantis, they have kind of human-like quality to them with the way their eyes point forward and they're almost bipedal. So if you're going to have the most human-like insect you could possibly have, it makes sense that it would be a mantis.
How do we know that you are real and not a DMT entity that tried to convince us otherwise?
You don't, but I would suggest applying Occam's razor.
Do you think that the subjective effects of psilocybin mushrooms significantly varies depending on strain?
So this is a question that I got a lot, and I've tried maybe 5 different strains of mushrooms, and I have only personally noticed difference in potency. A lot of people swear that they provide different subjective effect profiles, and I'm completely open to that idea because there are different amounts of tryptamines within them. But it's not something that I can personally pick up on. So I think that would have to be assessed through more of a formal study. I can't notice it myself.
Yeah, and especially a blinded study.
Yeah, I can't even notice the difference between 4-ASO-DMT and psilocybin mushrooms. To me, they just feel the same. And 4-ASO-DMT apparently metabolizes into psilocin, which psilocybin metabolizes into. And some people swear that they feel very different, but I can't notice the difference personally. And considering I spend a lot of my time analyzing the subjective effects of psychedelics, it does make me skeptical that the difference they are noticing is through placebo, but I'm also perfectly open to the possibility that maybe I'm just not picking up on something.
Yeah, I mean, there could be varying amounts and different varieties that some brains might just be more sensitive to than others.
Yeah, that's completely plausible.
Have you ever foraged for wild magic mushrooms?
I guess I quite naively foraged for psilocybin mushrooms when I was a teenager with absolutely no knowledge of where to find them or what to do, and I did not find any.
That's good.
Yeah, probably. My dad used to forage for them and knew all the good locations in the area that I grew up in, but I never got the chance to do it myself, and it was always easier just to grow them or get 4-ASO-DMT for me, so I never really bothered personally.
Have you ever tried nitrous oxide either by itself or mixed with LSD/psilocybin?
Yes. I have yet to find a hallucinogen that nitrous oxide doesn't mix well with. I suppose I'd be surprised if it mixed well with salvia or deliriants, but it just massively intensifies the psychedelic or dissociative effect for a couple of minutes, and it feels very euphoric, and I would highly recommend that combination.
Have you ever tried changa, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I've only tried changa once, and it essentially felt like smokable ayahuasca. It had all of the qualities of ayahuasca visual effects and cognitive effects, which I suppose was the addition of I think it was harmaline alkaloids that were added into it, but you just add an MOAI or an RAMA, which is how you would take ayahuasca orally. And I don't have a great deal to say about it other than the duration is longer, so it lasts around 45 minutes, similar to weed maybe. And I think I would maybe prefer it to DMT overall for that reason, but I haven't had that much of a chance to explore it fully.
Interesting. Hey, Josie. Do you have any experience with amanitas? And if so, what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, so I've taken amanita. Yeah. Well, I've taken the mushrooms a couple of times, and I could never get them to be potent enough to have an actual trip on them. But recently I discovered that muscimol extract is a thing, and it's a lot stronger. It is interesting. It's not a psychedelic or a delirium or a dissociative. It's in its own class. I know it affects a particular subset of the GABA receptor system, and it's actually most closely related to Ambien, at least of the other compounds that I've tried. It has kind of a dissociative quality to it, kind of a GABAergic quality to it, but even though I've tried to push it, I haven't really been able to get much other than a weird sedation from it, but I know other people who get full-blown psychedelic experiences from it, so it seems to vary quite a lot from individual to individual, probably kind of similarly to that of DXM, although I doubt it's enzyme-related in the same way.
I find it very stoning, very memory impairing, but with a good tactile enhancement component.
Yeah.
And we're talking about Amanita muscaria, not other versions of Amanita.
Yeah, or just muscimol extract. Yeah. Muscimol is the active component of the Amanita muscaria mushroom.
Do you have any experiences with 5-MeO-DMT, and if so, what is your opinion about it?
Yeah, so I have plenty of experiences with 5-MeO-DMT. It's not a psychedelic I particularly enjoy because, for me, it massively oversensitizes my skin on every single nerve ending of my body to a point that starts off being pleasurable and quickly crosses into painful. Very similar to the sensation of post-orgasm friction, I guess, that most people are probably familiar with at least at some point in their life, but on every single nerve ending of your body. And that's something that seems to happen to me specifically. And when I've had other psychedelics, such as DMT, available to me that I can use at ego depth levels very comfortably, it's completely chill, for me at least, I haven't felt the need to push it on something that is physically painful for me. It seems that any psychedelic that has a 5-MeO, they are physiologically sketchier than psychedelic tryptamines that do not have an MEO on them. From what I know about it, it seems to induce intense ego death and unity experiences, but there are very few visual effects. And instead of traditional psychedelic colorful patterns, there's often an all-encompassing white light and transpersonal experiences such as unity and ego dissolution, etc. The people who are really into 5-MeO DMT are passionate about it to an extent that concerns me. And I don't really have that much motivation to explore it further at this point.
Did you ever experience a bad trip? If so, what substance was used and what did you experience?
Yeah, so I've had a few bad trips. Now I think about it, at least 2 of them were on 1P LSD, and they primarily consisted of me going for ego death, not remembering what anything was, what I was, and thinking that something was horribly wrong, and then having an anxious freak out, but being so disorientated that I end up stuck in a sort of repetitive thought loop that continues over and over and over again. And this has happened on 1P LSD at least twice. It happened during the trip I described earlier, where I hallucinated that I was being arrested in front of my friends and family over and over and over again for...
naked, when they were pointing and laughing.
Yeah, for an eternity.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of another bad trip that I had. Oh, I had a bad trip on 4-ASO DET. I was going through a very bad breakup at the time, and I hallucinated that the laptop that was near me that had Discord open, I had somehow revealed all of my terrible secrets to Discord. I don't even know what those terrible secrets were, because I don't really think I have any terrible secrets. And that promptly made me go onto my Discord server and start very embarrassingly freaking out in all caps while people tried to calm me down in a sort of futile attempt. And then one of the people called me on Discord in a video chat, and if anything, that just made it worse, because in my brain it just sort of legitimized that something was going horribly wrong, and nothing was going horribly wrong. I just had the sensation that something was going horribly wrong, but it was completely non-specific. And I ended up calling multiple people. I called my partner at the time, my other partner at the time, another friend, and I was just freaking out. They couldn't calm me down. And then I would hang up and try and call someone else, hoping that they had the answer. It was quite embarrassing looking back on it. But generally speaking...
Poor thing.
Yeah. I don't really know what else to say about that, to be honest.
The question continues. Did you use any methods to get out of the bad trip, or do you accept it as part of the trip experience?
Okay, so with the 1P LSD experiences, something that I found very helpful was my partner at the time gave me a piece of paper that said, "You were just tripping on LSD, read this again." So I'd say, "You were just tripping on LSD, read this again." Then I'd read it again, immediately forget, and then I'd sort of go around in a loop because my short-term memory was 0 seconds. And that kind of kept me in a state of understanding what the situation was and sort of grounded me until I eventually came out of it.
Nice.
These were all during incredibly unstable periods of my life, to clarify.
Yeah.
Which is why I had a bad trip.
I've never experienced anything like that, honestly.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken Xanax with weed? If not, what about just weed? And do you see things while on it? Ever tried weed, Josie? In Colorado, where you live?
Yeah. I've tried weed. I've tried Xanax. I've tried weed and Xanax. It's pretty chill, yeah. And you don't really see things on it. You just...
I can get some closed eye visuals, like some, like not like strong ones, but just like, you know, it's like they like, you know, like shapes going around.
Yeah, I guess that could happen.
Colorful ones. I'm just, yeah.
You just feel very chill, and I get the munchies that I associate with weed, and the disinhibition that I have with Xanax, and I would just go and eat all of the sugary, terrible snacks that I possibly could, with not a care in the world.
Sounds like a chill yet regrettable time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Have you astral projected, and can you tell us about that experience?
Does astral projecting on drugs count? Because I feel like when people are referring to astral projection, they mean laying on a bed and meditating. Often there's different techniques, such as imagining a rope above your body and trying to pull yourself up with that rope using your spirit body or whatever. And I've tried that, but it hasn't worked. I've had plenty of out-of-body experiences and gone to other quote-unquote worlds under the influences of various hallucinogens, but that hasn't happened while I was sober. So if that counts as an astral projection, then yes, and if not, then no.
Have you ever had out-of-body experience or extrasensory perception?
I guess I answered the first part of that question just a moment ago. Extrasensory perception. I've had plenty of experiences where I assumed that I was psychically connected to whoever I was tripping with, and they were having the same experience as me, and we were reading
We've
each other's
done that
minds.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were like,
We had a psychic
oh
bond.
my god. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I come down, and it seems that that wasn't actually the case, and we weren't having the same experience.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least for me,
I mean,
personally.
similar experiences, and we were there together doing a thing. We were vibing.
Yeah. To me, it feels more like I just lose theory of mind. I lose the ability to understand that people know things I don't, and that I know things that they don't, and I just assume that information is being automatically transferred.
Wow. Yeah, if people assume that that happens like too much of the time, that could result in some really wicked miscommunications.
Mm-hmm.
If both of them think that they understand each other without saying anything.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. I wasn't even like implying anything. I was just saying.
I thought you were.
Oh, no, I wasn't.
Okay, that's
Okay.
fine.
Have you ever used violence against an entity or have ever heard anyone do it? I have a story about someone else doing it.
Okay.
I'll let you go.
If I've used violence, I've used violence against dream characters. If they get in my way. But not so much. I had an ayahuasca trip recently where the entities were trying to taunt me, and I was like, bro, dude, no, stop. This is my brain. And we came to a mutual understanding. There was no need for violence. But I've never heard of myself or anyone else actually being violent against an entity.
I was just thinking of that time the hypnagogyst was in an immersive hallucination and there was an entity and he felt like his body was possessed by the entity and the entity made him poke the entity like in the eye. And then he was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, because he'd poked the entity in the eye, but he had no volition to do so because his body was being controlled.
That barely even counts as violence. Yeah.
That's the only thing I thought of.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are your favorite books, and what books would you recommend on the topic of psychedelics?
Okay, I came prepared for this question.
Okay.
Oh my god.
Oh. I'm not sure if we're showing this part.
I'll be editing this. So, all of my favorite books are related to psychedelics or consciousness or philosophy anyway. So it's kind of just the same thing to me. My favorite books about, I guess, philosophy or consciousness are Alan Watts' The Book. It's called The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. It's just a very philosophical and whimsical book about how a person's sense of separate self as opposed to their external environment is pretty much an illusory construct of the human mind. This book, that's way too bright. Okay. This book, The Science of the Mind and the Myth of the Self, The Ego Tunnel by Thomas Metzinger, is on pretty much the exact same topic, but instead of talking about it from a philosophical or a poetical standpoint, it studies it from a neurological and scientific perspective. And I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's interested in neuroscience and consciousness. In terms of psychedelics, one of my favorites that I've already brought up multiple times is The Antipodes of the Mind, not Antipodes, Charting the Phenomenology of the Ayahuasca Experience by Benny Shannon. And this book is essentially a subjective effect index specifically for ayahuasca. It goes into the ayahuasca experience and breaks it down into its constituent components with all sorts of incredibly detailed descriptions. And I wish I read this book when I was a teenager instead of in the last year or two, because I think it would have been very formative for me and influential on my creation of the subjective effect index.
Yeah, quite a while ago, we were thinking about doing a live stream going through various little parts of the antipodes of the mind.
Yeah, I'm still open to do that, because
Yeah.
I have it
That could be fun.
completely annotated and highlighted and everything, so we absolutely could still. Other two books, which are classics that I would recommend, are Pickow and Tickow. So that stands for Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved and Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved by Alexander Shulgin and Anne Shulgin, both of which were close friends of Tom Ray, a friend of mine and the founder of the company that I work for. This guy is historically significant, and he personally invented hundreds of different psychedelic compounds. And the guy is just very, very significant. I would recommend looking through those books. My final recommendation is Reality Switch Technologies by Andrew R. Gallimore. This book is really cool. It basically goes through psychedelic neuroscience and subjective effects from a pretty easy to understand but in-depth kind of style, and it talks about consciousness as a world building engine, which is how I have personally conceptualized it as well, as in the experience that you have is sort of a simulation framework, both when you're sober and under the influence of mind-altering substances, and it talks about how these psychoactive substances result in alterations to that world-building engine. It's really interesting, and I think it came out quite recently, so I'd recommend picking it up. The other book I have here is just the DSM, which I wouldn't actually recommend.
Actually, another quick note on those. Do you have a top 3 overall?
Do I have a top 3? Okay, so my top 3 would be...
I think I know which 3, but I could be
It
wrong.
would be Reality Switch Technologies, Antipodes of the Mind, and The Ego Tunnel.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Those are my top 3.
Okay, and are there any in particular that you would recommend to a beginner in learning more about psychedelics and altered states of consciousness?
Reality Switch Technologies, because it's a much more general overview of hallucinogens, whereas the others are more niche and specific. Okay, I'm going to put these away now.
Who made the artwork on your channel and how is it made?
I often get questions with people asking me how I specifically made the artwork. I just want to take a moment to clarify that I made basically none of the artwork on the channel. The replications are primarily made by people from the replication community, and I guess the visionary art is made by the people in the visionary art community. But for every single piece of art that I show on my channel, unless I don't know who the artist is, there's a very few instances of that, I include credits to their social media. I even have a watermark in the bottom left corner.
Yeah, for our avatars, that's all hypnagogic.
Yeah, and a lot of the video editing is also done by hypnagogists. As for how they are made, it's a combination of After Effects and 3D modeling software such as Blender.
What types of music do you like to listen to?
What types of music do I like to listen to? Oh my god.
Bands, favorite artists,
Tally Hall.
Tally Hall.
Tally Hall.
Just for confusion.
Metric. I like Metric. I listen to a lot of lo-fi beats to study/chill to. Been listening to a lot of Sewer Slut lately. I listen to a lot of video game music.
Yeah, Celeste, we like that. We like.
Yeah, I like the Celeste soundtrack.
Yeah, various Nintendo music.
Yeah, I can't really pinpoint a specific genre of music that I listen to. I guess just stuff that I enjoy. Cass was licking his butthole on camera.
I mean, you know, if he wants
He's making
to share...
like slurping noises. I'm gonna come on. So the best music to trip to is whatever music you have positive associations with. If I had to choose trip music that sounds psychedelic for a person that I didn't know, I'd probably go for OTT or OTT. His most recent 3 albums, I think, are really good for that. I would probably also choose Tipper. Tipper's very good. If it's something more chilled out or laid back, like a dissociative trip, I would maybe choose Carbon-Based Lifeforms, particularly the albums World of Sleepers, Interloper, and The one album that has a red oil rig on the front that I cannot remember the name of.
We like Emancipator too.
Oh, Emancipator is great.
Yeah.
I would also highly recommend. Yeah, thanks. Emancipator is a really good choice.
Soon it will be cold enough.
Yeah, that's a great album.
Love that. Porter Robinson, the Nurture album.
Oh yeah, I think that's just an album that I really like.
Wait,
but
I've meaningfully tripped on that one.
yeah. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to people to trip.
I have openly wept.
Yeah, it's an incredible album. I just don't know if I'd put it on for someone to trip to if I didn't know them.
Yeah.
But it is a personal favorite of ours.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee, because caffeine.
Yeah, Josie didn't actually get into tea until she came to the US. The British aren't good enough at tea. I went to the UK and there was like a trivia question, what flavor is Earl Grey tea? And the British people didn't know. I was the only person in the room, the only American, who knew what flavor is Earl Grey tea. They don't think about tea there.
Yeah, they just have one kind of tea and it's boring and I don't particularly like it and it's very repetitive.
They have two kinds of tea in the UK. They have one pot of like one canister of tea that is like their breakfast tea, and another canister that's like Earl Grey, and they don't know what's in it.
I have no strong feelings about this one way or the other. Okay, what's the next question?
What's your favorite piece of psychedelic artwork? Or pieces?
My favorite pieces of psychedelic artwork probably include various replications and then also the original paintings by Hypnagogus that he keeps in our office.
Yeah.
I'll just show some clips of those.
Yeah, especially his Transcendence.
Oh yeah, I love his Transcendence piece, even if he's not a huge fan of it, apparently.
Well, he just, whatever. But it's like the original watercolor. We fortunately have there ready for us to view a lot of the time while we're working. What are your fave substances / least favorite, and what do you like / not like about them?
Okay.
Let's split this up, actually. There's a lot of people asking about favorite. Okay, favorite psychedelic.
All I can do is give a list. 2CB, 4-HO-MIPT, LSD, mescaline, 2CE.
Ayahuasca is one of your favorites.
I guess so.
Oh, really?
I mean, well, it's had a huge impact on me. I don't know if I would jump to it for a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and I like those all for different reasons. 2CB is good for parties. 4-HO-MIPT is good for sex. Mescaline is just a good, well-rounded psychedelic. LSD is great for hikes. I can't remember what the other one that I listed was. 2CE. 2CE is great for hallucinatory states. It induces incredibly vivid internal hallucinations and entities and places and scenes and stuff like that for me.
Yeah, I still haven't tried a lot of your favorites. We need to get on that.
We'll get around to it eventually.
Yeah. Okay, so what is your least favorite psychedelic?
DPT, because it gives really bad headaches, and that's about it, really.
Okay. Or least favorite substance overall?
Diphenhydramine, because it feels terrible.
Which psychedelic do you find the most insightful? Or that you've personally received the most insight from?
I would say ayahuasca is the substance that I've received the most therapeutic insight from, by far.
What psychoactive, in your opinion, has the greatest capacity for individual or societal good?
I would just say ayahuasca. I think that one, at least from my experience, has been the most beneficial for me, and I suspect the case might be the same for many other people, but I don't think it can really be narrowed down to an individual substance. That would just be a hunch if I had to pick only one.
And is there one that you think would specifically cause or has the most capacity to cause individual or societal harm?
I think tobacco has objectively caused the most societal harm in terms of the death rates, but we're talking about psychedelics here.
Yeah, so it's psychoactive.
Psychoactive. Okay, psychoactive, yeah, tobacco, I think, has caused, I think it's something like 1 billion people to die of lung cancer. So that just seems like the obvious choice.
Like outside of death, when it comes to just the things that things can do to people's mental states.
Methamphetamine, I think, is probably the worst for people's mental states that I have observed in the standard collection of dodgy street substances.
I was wondering if you and your cohorts would do live streams, please save for later as a playlist if so, with your favorite and or audience requested McKenna and Watts lectures, or etc., and pause to provide commentary/analysis and explore the concepts they present.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I can imagine
It's an
that.
interesting idea.
Like just like a little commentary video on it.
Well, it would be more of a live stream.
Yeah, well, but like a live stream like reaction to it.
Yeah, we'd
/commentary.
listen along together.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'd have to re-listen to McKenna lectures and see if I would have anything interesting to add on top of them, because I can't guarantee that I would.
Because it could just be some like, I agree with him here, I disagree with him here.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you wouldn't disagree with Terence McKenna.
No, never.
Have any philosophers/psychologists been instrumental to your personal growth and development? If so, who and why?
Terence McKenna and Alan Watts, I would say, have been the biggest influences on my worldview. Terence McKenna is pretty much my childhood hero. He's the guy who I heard say in a lecture once that we're not going to understand the psychedelic experience until we map it out. And that's what inspired me to start the Subjective Effect Index project when I realized that nobody had bothered to do that yet. And Alan Watts was very influential on me because he taught me a lot about the illusory nature of the self. And I don't agree with McKenna's entire worldview, but I have a lot of respect for him and I love the guy.
Which drug do you think gets most people HPPD?
I'm not sure that there's a drug that gives people more HPPD, but I think it's the N-BOM class. I remember back in the day when the N-BOMs were floating around a lot, people were saying that it was giving them permanent HPPD, perhaps related to the fact that I think it's 2,5-I N-BOM in particular is a full agonist of the serotonin receptor, which other psychedelics simply do not do, and is apparently actually dangerous. So I think it's the N-BOMs, but I think it's much more likely related to how often you use a compound more than what that compound is.
Have you ever had HPPD, and if you did, how did you deal with it /thoughts on HPPD?
So I used to have pretty prominent what people would refer to as HPPD when I was using psychedelics at least once a week, if not multiple times a week for a couple of years in a row, probably.
Don't do that, kids. Like, it is dumb. Like, that's abuse at that point, TBH.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course it is. But yeah, from what I can tell, everybody who uses psychedelics regularly develops some kind of HPPD, as in they will commonly experience mild visual distortions and psychedelic geometry. While they are sober, visual snow is also very common, and heightened dreams. Another thing is that weed will start to take on a more psychedelic quality. When they smoke it, they'll be much more likely to get psychedelic visual effects, such as just geometry and open eye visual distortions and color enhancement and stuff like that. The thing is, though, everybody who I've ever met who has developed HPPD has not actually had it occur in such a way that it's detrimental to their day-to-day lives. They can still function, they can still drive, even they can still read just fine. It doesn't affect their motor control or their fine vision. And in the DSM, if I just find the right section, the diagnostic criteria for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder is following cessation of use of a hallucinogen, the re-experiencing of one or more of the perceptual symptoms that were experienced while intoxicated with the hallucinogen. So it just lists things like geometric hallucinations, false perceptions of movement in the peripheral visual field, flashes of color, intensified colors, trails of images or moving objects, standard stuff. I won't read all of them. But then the following two symptoms that are necessary in order for it to be a disorder are it causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and the symptoms are not attributable to another medical condition. So the diagnostic criteria B, that it's causing clinically significant impairment or distress, is basically never there, at least with the people that I've met, when they talk about getting HPPD. And I would therefore say that they do not have it to a disordered extent. If it is genuinely causing them impairment, then it's a problem. But if they can still function, then I don't think it's that big of a deal, and if it bothers them, they should just trip less, and it'll fade away within 6 months to a year, generally speaking.
Yeah. I remember hearing someone talk about getting HPPD. Well, I say that, like having persistent minor visual effects, and then that being very distressing to them for a period of time. And then they heard that someone else also gets it, and the other person was chill with it. And they're just like, oh, I guess it's fine.
Yeah, a lot of people get it, and then they think that they've permanently broken their brain or something, even though there's no actual impairment in their functioning. It's just kind of a cultural assumption, and eventually it just kind of fades away anyway. So my take on HPPD is that it's almost universal for people that trip regularly, and that it's also not that big of a deal.
Yeah, well, if we're by HPPD, we mean having some persistent visual hallucinatory, like visual effects.
Yeah, we should just call it HPP.
HPP.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Next question.
How do I convince my ultra-conservative-ass government that the banned psychedelics are healthier than the still legal ethanol?
I have no idea.
$1 million question.
Yeah. Best of luck. I guess, how did it happen in the US? There were studies and organizations that advocated for it over decades and decades and decades.
And by in the US, we mean in specific states that have decriminalized various...
Right, I'm thinking Colorado and Oregon, and then there are places in Canada. I think it's been decriminalized in Canada, or a lot of places in Canada now. Australia legalized MDMA and psychedelics for treatment of PTSD recently within just their healthcare system. And I guess I would analyze how those countries went about it and see if you can kind of replicate that in your own country. I don't think it's something that any one individual could ever do, though. It's something a very large group of people would have to pretty much dedicate their entire lives to.
Yeah, it is really great to see that Colorado did pass the decriminalization of plant psychedelics via popular vote through a ballot initiative. So at least in places like Colorado, public opinion is shifting in really good ways.
Yeah.
Do you think psychedelic legalization is far off or close by?
I think it's close by in some places and as far off as ever in other places. In the US, it seems that we are going to go through a similar thing with the legalization of cannabis over the next 10 or 20 years. I think it's going to be medicalized first and then maybe recreationalized, I don't know if that's a word, later on down the line. But I imagine in more conservative countries, it's just going to stay the same. There are places in the world where alcohol is still illegal, so it's really going to depend on where you are.
How would you approach/convince someone conservative about drugs in general? I wouldn't necessarily convince them about drugs in general.
Yeah, I think there isn't really a need for it most of the time. Often, even if these people could really benefit from the use of psychedelics, they're not going to do it. I would try and talk about it in terms of the evidence and talk about places that have legalized or decriminalized these things and talk about various studies, but it's not going to change their mind. It might plant a seed that could grow later on down the line, but I think most people are generally stuck in their ways, especially conservative people.
I think talking about the treatment aspect, the therapeutic aspect, is in general good. And I think also making a very clear distinction between certain psychedelics and clarifying how different it is from benzodiazepines and opiates and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, talking about the non-addictive qualities.
Yeah, bringing up that psychedelics can't really be used frequently because of the instant tolerance. I think that's a pretty good thing to talk about.
That helps. That you can't overdose on the majority of them. If we're talking about something like psilocybin, at least you can't physically overdose on them in a way that will be fatal, is something worth bringing up. But I tend to have little patience for those kinds of conversations because I'm in my own little bubble and I don't need to worry about it. It's probably different for other people. So I don't think I can offer much good specific advice.
Yeah, well, I'm like a conservative, Southern U.S. family. And yeah, I think making a clear distinction between the get addicted, ruin your life drugs and the have therapeutic experiences, occasionally drugs, I think bringing that distinction can be really important for certain cultures at least.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you think that peyote should remain illegal for people who are not in the Native American church to help conserve it growing wild?
Yeah, I think using an endangered species just to get high should be illegal, not because of the mescaline, but because it's an endangered plant. You can just get San Pedro, which grows relatively plentifully, or the drug can be synthesized. It's bad for the species to overuse it. So I think that should, yeah, I think that should be illegal for the plant's sake.
Yeah, so it's more of an endangered species concern than anything
Yeah,
else.
we don't need to be using peyote.
Yeah. Do you think all drugs should be legal? Barring endangered species concerns, I suppose.
There was one very specific example of a HIV medication that was being used recreationally in Africa that was making the HIV virus more resistant to the medication because of people overusing it, similar to overuse of antibiotics. And I think it would make sense for that to be illegal because using it is actually hurting other people. Otherwise, no, I don't think substances should be illegal. I don't think they should be freely available for everyone at any time. But I think people should be able to do what they want with their own consciousness.
I think that there should be strict regulations on people selling things for consumer protection purposes.
Yeah, it should be heavily regulated.
Yeah.
But I don't think it should be straight up illegal.
Yeah. If for some reason you'd have the ability to completely legalize one combination mix of drugs in your country, what would it be?
I feel like I'm just going to choose an unrelated combination so people can use them separately, but that's not what the question's asking me. Ayahuasca, so... Wait, Syrian Rue is already legal.
I mean, is there like a... Do you have a favorite drug combo?
Fuck it, yeah, I would legalize candy flipping, just for the hell of it. So LSD and MDMA.
I would do 4-ACO MDMA.
Okay, so you'd legalize hippie flipping.
Yeah, because I'm a psilocybin person instead of an LSD person. So,
Yeah.
do you meditate?
I do not meditate. I probably should. I've had periods in my life where I've meditated on a daily basis for very long stretches of time, and I found it beneficial. But for me, I've only really meditated in periods of my life where I've been deeply unstable to the point where I'm barely hanging on. And then when I become more stable, I tend to just fall out of the habit. So I do not currently have a meditation practice, although I probably should. It's good mental hygiene.
What's your take on meditation and its relationship with psychedelics?
I think they are distinctly different things, but there's a lot of overlap in their benefits and outcomes. They're both good for softening the ego or quieting the default mode network, and I think they can take you to similar places, even if they are quite different experiences.
Is microdosing more or less effective than macrodosing in terms of classic psychs?
Less effective for therapeutic outcomes. I think you need to macro dose, you need the full experience. I guess there's some kind of ambiguous evidence that microdosing psychedelics is good for depression and things like that, but I think having a few very profound experiences is often more impactful for the average person than just having lots of microdose experiences that are basically just sub-perceptual.
Yeah, well, there seems to be a real difference in how different people use the term microdose. Because some people, they're talking about a level 1 or even 2 experience. Whereas we would consider at the point that you are like noticeably experiencing effects to be a macro dose, basically. There was we were looking into, for the 7 levels of the psychedelic experience video, we were looking into microdosing just a little bit. We were thinking about doing something about it at a future time. And what we saw were some analyses of some different methodologies studying the efficacy of microdosing for a couple different measures. And it seems like it doesn't tend to perform much better than placebo in a situation where you're genuinely not experiencing any effects at a conscious level.
Yeah, I haven't personally noticed much benefit from microdosing at all. If I microdose LSD, it just slightly increases my anxiety. If I microdose psilocybin, it does genuinely seem to really improve my mood. But it's not beneficial enough that I find myself coming back to it. I prefer to just use things like nootropics to make myself more productive and functional throughout the day, which I think is what a lot of people use microdose psychedelics for.
Yeah, here's a question. Yeah. So another question about microdosing. What's your opinion about microdosing LSD causing derealization?
If microdosing LSD is causing you derealization and it's a problem for you, then I would suggest that you stop microdosing LSD. I haven't heard anyone specifically talking about that, but I could easily see it happening.
Yeah, this isn't something that we've personally heard about. What was your most profound experience while tripping?
My most profound experience or experiences while tripping were all level 4 Unity experiences that occurred on, I guess, 4 or 5 different separate occasions. And for the first 4 of those experiences, I have trip reports available for them all on effectindex.com. I essentially lost all sense of separation between my sense of self and my internally stored model of reality. So I felt and understood that the previously experienced separation was an illusory construct of the human mind, and that I was in fact the entire universe and all of existence experiencing itself through the particular point in space and time that my body happens to be in. And those were very, very formative experiences for me. I don't write trip reports very often. I tend to just document specific subjective effects. But I wrote trip reports for those experiences because I am very passionate about unity or non-dualist experiences, and I think they have huge potential to shape humanity if they were better understood by science.
What's the weirdest or most bizarre psychedelic experience you've had?
If we're limiting it to just psychedelics, then it would just be individual hallucinations that I've seen. For example, I have a reoccurring hallucination of somebody vomiting a torrent of bananas. That happens quite a lot on psychedelics. I once saw a Shrek version of Mario Kart and 4 Homette in extremely vivid detail, but those don't feel that bizarre to me. They just seem more like the hallucinatory equivalent of a shitpost. I think the actual bizarre, weird, strange stuff happens for me all on salvia. So becoming inanimate objects like a roof or a brick in the wall, becoming an incomprehensible machinescape, having your body reconfigured into a series of gears, cogs, pulleys, conveyor belts, zippers, things like that is extremely bizarre, and I have no real speculative explanation for why the human brain quite consistently does that under the influence of this very particular substance. Usually I have an explanation or a hypothesis where I think, yeah, that's probably the answer, and with this I just don't. I don't know why machinescapes are so common on salvia. I don't know why becoming inanimate objects are so common on salvia. It's the strangest and most bizarre experience a person can go through, I think, the salvia trip.
What are your thoughts on using nicotine gum as a substitute for ADHD medications?
It works for some people from what I've heard. If it works for you, then great, keep doing it. If it doesn't, then I don't know, it's probably not effective. Find something else.
Yeah, ADHD seems to have a lot of individual variants.
Yeah, with people with ADHD, they usually need a particular compound. So one person will find Ritalin really useful, but hate Adderall. And there'll be another person that's the other way around. And you kind of just need to rotate the different ADHD medications to find which one works for your particular brain. So maybe it's nicotine patches. I haven't noticed that myself as somebody with ADHD.
Okay, here's a question that I don't think you can reasonably answer. How many trips do you think you've had in total per each substance?
Oh my fucking god.
This isn't happening, y'all.
So I think I have had hundreds. It's in the hundreds of trips. I had a list once of all of the different psychoactive substances that I had ever tried, and it was over 120 different compounds. And that was on a random Psychonaut Wiki notes page back in 2017. And since then, I've tried many more substances, although not at the same rate, because I don't find trying new things as interesting as I used to. It's diminishing returns on trying every new novel research chemical that comes onto the market. And it's basically impossible for me to say. I think I've had over 100 LSD experiences. I couldn't really quantify for other substances. I was not keeping track, and I also have dyscalculia, so I'm very bad at memorizing numbers.
Do you ever feel like you use psychedelics to look for answers you have within?
What does that mean? Like for introspection?
I guess so.
Yeah, I use psychedelics for therapeutic introspection or getting insight from my subconscious or trying to figure out how to handle a problem in my life, I think is what you meant by that.
What do you do in your free time when you're not working on videos or tripping or doing research?
It's a good question.
I like to play platformers sometimes.
Yeah, I play video games.
We have a lesbian farm on Stardew Valley.
Yeah, hang out with my partners and my cats, browse social media mindlessly. In the summer, I like going cycling and going outside.
Just being a person.
Yeah, just general stuff that people do.
We eat snacks sometimes.
I eat snacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that.
What did you think after coming down from your first psychedelic experience?
So, my first psychedelic experience, I felt that I had discovered something incredibly profound, and my first thought was, I need to find more of this stuff. This is important. This is something that I can tell I'm going to be very passionate about. I've discovered something very important. I need to find more. That was basically my thought.
What is your key to not fear what you are about to witness, whether it's about a trip or things coming up in someone's life? Do you have any courageous things or just accepting scary things?
I don't really get pre-trip anxiety.
It's just different people get it or don't, and it doesn't make someone more or less good at psychedelics, really, I think.
I know a lot of people that get pre-trip anxiety that are very experienced psychonauts, and it's almost just a sort of physiological reaction to the fact that they're about to enter an altered state, rather than something that's particularly rational. So I guess my suggestion, within reason, would be to just try and go ahead and do it anyway, if it's something that you're pursuing and something that's important to you.
Yeah, and like when it comes to this kind of thing, I feel like there's some attitudes in the psychedelic community that it's some kind of failing to even be nervous in the first place. Mm-hmm. And like, just be nervous.
Yeah.
It'll be so much worse to be nervous about being nervous.
I agree with that completely.
Why and when did you first start taking psychedelics?
I was aware of psychedelics as a concept as a 16-year-old. I briefly skimmed over the Wikipedia article on LSD and didn't really look much more into it. And I thought that they would make me more creative because I had heard that somewhere. Can't remember where I heard it. And because of that, I just sort of had a passing interest in trying them. I was offered psychedelics completely spontaneously by some kid, I was also 17, standing outside of a cinema in my hometown. I'd never met him before, and I thought, yeah, right. So I gave it a try, and it was very life-changing stuff. But I just kind of walked into it blindly, for the most part.
Has your psychedelic drug use had any negative impacts on your life?
I don't think my psychedelic use has had any negative impact on my life. I would say that there is a lot of substance use in general that has had negative impact on my life. For example, benzodiazepines, which I found very addictive for a couple of years, or deliriants, which I've talked about multiple times already. But as for psychedelics, it's largely been positive. I've had experiences that have been bad while I was undergoing them, but nothing that feels like it's had long-term consequences for me. I feel like they've only been beneficial, not miracle cures by any means, but...
Yeah, but you've never, like, had a trip and, like, gotten yourself arrested or anything?
No.
Cool.
Yeah.
How do you deal with cranks and crackpots?
So...
You just laugh at them.
Okay, I went for a period on my YouTube channel where I would intensely troll them because I thought it was funny. For example, at the top of my Psychedelic Entities video, I pinned a comment saying, "I'm sorry guys, I've never even tried a psychedelic before in my life. I'm too scared. Please find it within yourself to forgive me. Namaste." And then so many people were angry at me and sending me horrible messages and all these other things. And it was so obviously a joke. And I just kept replying to them in an increasingly ridiculous fashion. And I found that no matter how stupid I got, there was always someone that took the bait. And I've decided to not do that anymore because I feel like one day someone who's angry at me for not believing in DMT entities is going to hunt me down or something like that. So my technique for dealing with cranks and crackpots now is just to avoid them.
What was the paradigm shift that caused you to want to explore psychedelic experiences in the physical world? I don't know what it means by in the physical world.
In the physical world? Sorry, I take psychedelic. I'm in the physical world.
Was there a paradigm shift that made you want to explore psychedelics?
I tried a psychedelic because someone offered it to me. I thought it was pretty cool. And there was a paradigm shift because while I was tripping, I started Googling psychedelics. I started researching psychedelics for the first time during my first psychedelic trip. And I found myself watching Terence McKenna videos on YouTube. I'd never even heard of Terence McKenna before. And they were so profound and mind-blowing that it just immediately became a lifelong passion. So I think that's an answer.
Yeah, I figured that would be what it was. Would you go on Joe Rogan or any other major podcast given the chance?
Sure. If they reached out to me, I'd be down. I'm not going to reach out to other people to have me on their platform. But if people reach out to me, I'm generally down to talk to anyone.
Thoughts on the term cosmic giggle?
Yeah, so me and my teenage bro friends used to use the term cosmic giggle a lot, and we'd always joke that I had the most cosmic giggle and that I needed to share some of my cosmic giggle with the rest of them. And it's basically a Terence McKenna term. The cosmic giggle is like your magical good luck, fortune, or destiny. Like, I'm riding the wave of the cosmic giggle with all my psychedelic research and my weird existence. It's because of the cosmic giggle
you have a lot of cosmic
I have a lot of cosmic giggle. Yeah. So my thoughts on the term cosmic giggle is that I like it, but I haven't even thought about it in about 10 years until I saw that question.
Memory unlocked.
Yeah.
Compare all the benzos you've taken.
Oh my God.
Let's just say favorite, least favorite.
Okay, it's tempting to open up Psychonaut Wiki, but this video, we're not even halfway through. Yeah. Okay, so favorite benzo, Xanax or Atizalam. Atizalam has a very short duration, which I like, and it doesn't cause me to have some kind of a hangover the next day. I've abused benzos to such an extent that I can get instant withdrawals from certain ones. Clonazepam was my benzodiazepine of choice. I would say that it's the most recreational benzodiazepine, which is not necessarily a good thing, because the problem with benzos is that they are too good at what they do. They are too good at just eliminating negative emotions, and that can be a very tempting thing if you're experiencing a lot of negative emotions. I'm trying to think of some other benzos that I've used. Flubromazolam, or is it Frublomazolam? I can't remember. Oh my God, there were these two ones. I think it's like bromazolam and flubromazolam. One of those has an insanely long duration, which back in the day, at the height of the research chemical market in, say, 2015 in the United Kingdom, the duration was so long that you could be blacked out and order another batch and it would arrive before it even worn off. And that was terrible. It was really bad. The duration's way too long on that one. I can't remember any other benzodiazepines that I have taken off the top of my... Oh, temazepam. I took my first experience of a benzodiazepine was temazepam. A friend had a prescription for it. I was like 17. He gave it to me. I tried it, didn't feel anything. So naturally, I took the rest of the packet. And I just woke up the next day with no recollection of what had happened. And these days, my test for if I got really high on benzos is, do I remember going to sleep? If I didn't remember going to sleep, then I blacked out. I can't think of any other benzos off the top of my head. Oh, wait. Klonopin.
Ah, Klonopin.
Klonopin, of course. Yeah, so Klonopin has a long duration, but it has too much emphasis on physical muscle relaxation. I do like physical muscle relaxation at all, but it's disproportionate because what I'm mostly looking for is a reduction of baseline anxiety, and it just doesn't feel as recreational as the others. There's another one.
Like, we don't need to...
Okay, it's fine. I'm moving on to the next question. We're moving on.
Do you feel a part of your purpose in this world is to articulate these experiences on such a beautiful level? Why, yes, I do. Okay, I can reread it.
Okay.
Okay, should I read it?
Yeah.
Do you feel a part of your purpose in this world is to articulate these experiences on such a beautiful level?
The rational part of me thinks that this is just a very intense passion or hobby or autistic special interest, and that I've just spent the last decade kind of honing my craft, and that it's all because I took a personal interest in it and I decided to do it before somebody else got the idea first, which they inevitably would have. However, when I am tripping, I feel that I am a cosmic vessel destined to carry out subjective effect documentation, to progress the exponential self-complexification of the universe and bring about the inevitable transcendental object at the end of time. But when I'm sober, I don't really feel that way.
How have psychedelics played a part in the experience of your creativity?
This is very difficult for me to answer because most of my adult development, or all of my adult development even, took place after I started using psychedelics. I guess I was very creative as a teenager. I was always really into making art and writing, but I just kind of continued to do that after I discovered psychedelics. I've had a lot of inspiration from psychedelics, and I often come to ideas and conclusions while under the influence of psychedelics, but it's hard for me to compare it to a hypothetical world where I never tried a psychedelic.
Yeah, I got into psychedelics later in adulthood than you did, and like I was a creative person. Like I've done NaNoWriMo a couple times. I do various crafting things, and I don't think that using psychedelics has increased my desire to do those things, though I think it can definitely give inspiration. If ego death can make people more egotistical, if psychedelics can make hippies even more woo-woo, if it can make Christians closer to God, if it can make psychopaths create murder cults, did they make you even more rational?
This is quoting a conversation I had on Twitter.
What is this?
Did psychedelics make me more rational? I don't think so. Not really. I think... So I'm not saying that I'm completely rational. I can be very irrational. I have emotions and stuff. I'm a human.
Yeah.
But I've always been more into the kind of materialist, skeptical framework, at least from my teenage years, and that worldview has carried through during my psychedelic explorations. And I'm not convinced that psychedelics made me more rational, to be honest. I don't think they really impacted that.
What's a question you wish more people would ask you? And I'm going to give you some leading on this. What aspect of what you do you wish people cared more about? Like, it's easy to make people care about visuals, say.
Okay, I wish people cared more about the articles and text documentation that I have written elsewhere that I have yet to convert into video essay form, because I've created so much content that is not on YouTube, and most of my YouTube content is just taking things I've already written over the last decade or so and converting them into video essays.
Well, I mean, we've been doing less of just straight doing that more recently.
I guess so, but that's at least how I got started out.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of plans for stuff that is basically just doing that.
I'm always going to.
But I mean, that's not really what they asked, though, because
Yeah.
it's not what do you wish people would take more of an interest in. It's what do you wish people would ask me more about.
Well, I guess I bet you'd be really love to get a question about one of these studies that you haven't, or one of these articles that you haven't turned into a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I guess
a
so.
video.
I like it when people ask me about specific subjective effects, and I don't like it when people ask me, have you tried very common drug?
What about salvia?
Have you ever tried ketamine? I find those questions kind of annoying.
Tried 5-MeO DMT?
Yeah, well, okay, it's not annoying in the context of this video because that's the point. That's the point here. But whenever I stream, it's just like the same questions over and over again, which is why we're making this video. So I can just be like, go watch the video.
And like for the record, like it's not that they're necessarily bad questions. It's just how frequent they are that becomes kind of an issue, I guess. Is there a psychedelic you will never do? If so, why? Did you try the N-Bum things?
Yeah, I did 2,5-IM-BOM. There are psychedelics that I would never bother to try again, but there's never been a psychedelic where I thought, I'm never going to try that. So I don't think so. Psychedelics I would never bother to try again maybe include DPT. DOB is really boring. I can't think of any more.
Okay. Well, what about the N-Bum things because they're dangerous? Cause, like,
I probably wouldn't do it. I probably wouldn't do N-BOMs again. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's something you're still curious about in the realm of psychedelics?
I guess I'm really curious about the neurological and psychological triggers for states of non-dualist, high-level unity experiences. I want to figure out what causes those. They're very inconsistent. I can't seem to see any correlations behind people's predispositions or anything like that. I want a better understanding of that. That's something I'm really, really interested in.
What do you think about psyched substance?
So we interacted on Facebook, I think maybe in 2017. He seems fine. I don't think I'm his target audience, really. He's mostly making content for, I guess, bros that don't know anything about psychedelics, and that's an audience that needs to be catered towards. I do think he needs to stop trying to rules lawyer the algorithm and just kind of accept some level of self-censorship if he wants to continue monetizing his videos, because he complains about his videos getting demonetized, and then you look at the thumbnail and it's like him holding a giant bag of white powder or something. It's always something absurd like that. So I think he should maybe integrate algo speak and self-censorship into his videos just a little more so that he can continue to monetize his career. But it's like, he seems cool.
It would be cool to collaborate.
I would totally collab with him. That would be really cool if he ever wanted to have me on his channel, if he reached out to me. But yeah.
Can you do a room tour?
Yeah, I recorded one earlier. I'll just, future me will play it over my voice now.
Yeah, you just be like, yes, here it is.
Okay, so this is my room. It's not particularly interesting to me, at least. These are all the states I visited, apart from Florida. I haven't highlighted that one yet. This is my map of my home country. Favorite nostalgic video game. Cosmic calendar poster. Favorite TV show. An absurd amount of plushies. As you can see, I have gamer lights around the perimeter of the ceiling. This is my cat Casper. This is our lovely ornate sconce inside of our cupboard. This is my desk. My cool molecule desk mat. This is Emily's desk. This is our shared bedroom. Some art, lots of art. This is my GameCube game collection, many of which don't have their case covers anymore. My cat likes to hang out up here. This is some Sunterry art, great artist. I'll leave that up to your own speculation. This is the window well, garden gnome, and yeah, I mean, don't really know what else to say, really. I think that's everything.
You mentioned after your CAT scan having basically no resting brain state and or something about lacking default mode network activity. I was curious about how you relate that new knowledge to your experiences with depersonalization being a kind of default state for you. Your interviews involving dissociation are super helpful and illuminating to me going through the same thing.
That was a really long question. It's an interesting topic, but I'm not sure. What was the specific question? I do want to get into this.
Let's see. How do you relate the new information that you got from having your brain scanned to your previous experiences of depersonalization?
Okay, so first of all, it wasn't a CAT scan, it was an EEG. And I guess the thing that was most beneficial was that it was very validating. But I can't say much more beyond that. It was a pretty emotional experience for me. Apparently, my brain state highly correlates with all sorts of psychological disorders and is extremely neurodivergent. But my default mode network having basically no activity in it was very interesting because I'm in a constant state of depersonalization. I don't have a sense of self. I've been that way since I was very young.
Yeah, and I always want to bring this up because I assume that people are going to make assumptions. Josie did begin experiencing depersonalization before she ever experienced psychedelics.
Yeah, psychedelics removed my depersonalization for, I think, 2 to 3 years, and then it just kind of came back again. So, guess I just don't have a sense of self. Guess my default mode network is turned off, apparently, according to brain scans. Oh well.
Has any of this information negatively affected you in relation to culture, society, and relationships?
Okay.
Which information is it talking about?
The information about how crazy psychedelics are, man. I assume.
God.
Yeah. So when I was quite young, I felt very alienated when I felt that I had discovered a chemical portal to inner space, and it was this profoundly historically significant thing that could drastically change all of society, and nobody was talking about it. It wasn't on the mainstream media. My family didn't care. My friends, a lot of them weren't really that excited about it. It made me feel really alienated that everybody wasn't talking about this. I was in probably somewhat of a state of mania because of this profound new discovery. I guess in terms of my relationships, my first relationship with my girlfriend when I was 16, she told me that I basically lost complete interest in her after I discovered psychedelics, and that was the thing and the only thing that I would hyperfixate on. So I guess that's an example of a relationship problem that has resulted from my use of psychedelics, but I was a teenager at the time, and that's all I can really think of. Otherwise, no, not really.
What do you like doing when you are tripping?
Okay, so when I'm tripping, I like to lay in bed with soft lighting and soothing music and blankets, and that's about it. I like sex while tripping, I guess, as well. But I like to be in my bedroom, doing bedroomy stuff.
Unless it's like a LSD hike or whatever.
Yeah, sometimes it's really cool doing hikes out in nature. I used to trip out in nature a lot more when I was younger, but less so as an adult.
Yeah, because now you have a nice house where your parents don't live.
Yeah, exactly.
How many children are you planning or wishing to have? 1, 2, more?
None. I'm probably infertile, so
Yeah.
no babies for me. I have an urge to reproduce, like this kind of primal thing that might be embedded in me through 4 billion years of evolution, but I'm ignoring it because it probably goes against my better judgment.
I just don't want kids.
Yeah, neither do I.
If you never took psychedelics, how different would your life be? Do you think it would be better or worse? Could you live without psychedelics?
Okay, I'm answer this one by one. How different would my life be if I didn't take psychedelics? Probably very different.
Entirely different.
I think I would be living
Back in England.
I'd be living in England.
England.
Of all places. And I don't know what I would be like. I think I would be a nerd. That wouldn't change. I'd probably rely a lot more on consumption of culture. I think I probably would have thrown myself at some other hyperfixation interest. But it's impossible for me to say what. Okay, what was the next one?
Do you think it would be better or worse?
I think it would be worse. A lot worse, yeah. I don't think it would be terrible, but I don't think my life would be as fulfilling or meaningful without them.
Could you live without psychedelics?
Yeah. At this point, I could live without psychedelics.
Yeah, honestly, I have to like convince her to trip with me.
Yeah, the motivation isn't there as much for me anymore as it used to be, and I've noticed that tends to be a thing with people that go really hard on psychedelics and then continue to do that for 10 years or so.
Would you be happy to speak via Zoom or even live in front of a small audience, example around 100 people, about what you have learned or generally find significant in regard to this topic for a psychedelic society in Central European city?
Yeah, sure. Just email me. I feel like this is a really inefficient means of communication for that sort of thing. Just send me an email.
Yeah. What's the biggest dose of psychedelics you've ever taken?
Oh, okay. Just psychedelics?
The psychedelics. Though sometimes people use the term psychedelics when they mean all hallucinogens.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this. I once took 80 mg of 4-ACDMT, which doesn't sound like that much, but I combined it with 5 grams of Syrian rue, which about doubles the potency, which to me came out to about 160 mg of 4-ACDMT, and I was just obliterated.
It's like, do you remember anything?
I vaguely remember a sci-fi futuristic cityscape, and the rest of it was just unconsciousness, essentially. And then there was another time where I combined, 4-ACDMT, 2CB, 2CC, 2CE, 2CI, MDMA, MXE, and DPH. And that was a really intense trip. Would not recommend.
Yeah. What are your hobbies? I feel like we kind of already addressed this. Eating snacks.
No, this is my hobby.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I would
that's
say that
true.
this is my...
But
Okay.
Plus video games.
Yeah, plus video games. Outside of...
You're gonna play some Pathfinder?
Yeah, I like tabletop role-playing games. I haven't been able to play them in quite a while, but those are cool. Do I have hobbies outside of psychedelic research?
Video games?
Consumption of media, I
Yeah.
suppose. I feel like all my creative output goes into this.
What's your least favorite question that people ask you? Have you ever tried salvia?
No, my least favorite question is, what is your favorite drug?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like asking someone what their favorite food is when they're not a 10-year-old, I guess. Like, it depends what I'm craving, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Have you ever been psychotic?
Have I ever been psychotic? Okay, so my distinction between being delusional and being psychotic is you can think something that is very delusional in your brain and be extremely paranoid and have all these elaborate scenarios that aren't actually true, but you're not actually psychotic in my mind until you get up and start flailing around and trying to interact with your external environment under those assumptions. And I have never done that. I seem to be remarkably prone to not having psychosis. Maybe I had it that one time when I started typing on Discord, which I shouldn't have done. But even then, that was probably an edge case. I think I was more delusional. I seem to be weirdly resistant to psychosis.
Have you ever experienced drug-like states of the mind while or after exercising?
I haven't. I know people talk about runner's high and stuff. I never experienced that when I'm exercising.
Do you like open eye or closed eye visuals more?
Closed eye. Because closed eye are more elaborate, hallucinatory things, and open eye are mostly just distortions and visual amplifications, which is cool, but less interesting. There's less variety.
How are you?
I'm alright. You?
What's your favorite food?
Oh, okay. Chocolate.
Milk chocolate, because...
Cadbury's milk chocolate.
yeah, the English
Yeah.
version, not the American
not
version.
American. I don't like
Yeah.
American chocolate.
What psychedelic is the most fun for you?
2CB or 4-HO-MIPT.
Which substances do you regret trying?
DPH.
How often do you use psychedelics?
These days, once every few months, maybe?
Yeah, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. Have you ever read
Ramdas.
Ramdas? That's how you pronounce it?
Yeah, he's the Be Here Now guy. I haven't. I'm aware of him, but no, I haven't read his books.
Why did this pop up on the top of my recommendations?
I don't know. I guess the algorithm thinks you might be interested in psychedelics.
Have you ever attended an ayahuasca ceremony?
I haven't attended an ayahuasca ceremony. I would like to. As a young edgelord teenager, I was very opposed to the idea of tripping in the presence of shaman with a bunch of ritual and stuff like that, because so many people said that you had to do it as the only way you could take ayahuasca. So I would take ayahuasca and like walk into a McDonald's or go to a cinema or go to the pub, not because it was a good combination, but just to prove that you could do it and the ayahuasca gods wouldn't punish you and that it wouldn't be any different from going into those environments while on any other psychedelic. So I did that for quite a bit, but these days I think going to an ayahuasca ceremony would actually be really interesting, and I kind of see how ritual can really change the outcome of the experience, especially after I had a ketamine therapy session that had a lot of Native American ritual stuff involved in it recently.
How many cats do you have, and what are their names? And can you show them in the video? Okay, Casper already spent quite a bit of time on my lap here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how well you could see him.
We could pick him up and put him on camera.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Casper, I'm sorry, buddy.
Yeah. Come here,
Okay,
sweet boy.
Okay. This is Casper. He's a very sweet boy.
Oh.
Okay, I'll put you down now. Present him to the camera if you like.
Okay, that's right. The camera is like... Okay.
Okay. And this is Totoro. Who probably doesn't like this. Who we quite recently adopted. I'll try and get close to the camera. Okay, you can go now, buddy.
Yeah, here you go, bud. How deep have you personally gone with the classic psychedelics such as mushrooms, LSD, and DMT?
All the way.
All the way.
Beyond ego death and into
Oblivion.
unconsciousness, passing out into ego death. Many times.
Did you ever ask yourself why you continue to do such substances again, and at any time does it ever seem pointless?
Yeah, so
That's why you don't trip as much.
Pretty much. I mean, Alan Watts has the famous quote, when you get the message, hang up the phone. And I quite often feel like using psychedelics over and over and over and over again is not beneficial to me, which is why I do them less these days.
Can you make a series of videos that are like a beginner's guide for different drugs, like recommended beginner doses for shrooms, best places to do them, etc.? No.
Yeah, I founded this website called Psychonaut Wiki. It already has all that information on it, and I don't need to worry about my channel being blanket demonetized. So just go check out psychonautwiki.org.
Yeah, and there's information about that in a lot of other places.
Yeah, it's been done time and time again.
We see people asking sometimes in various videos, how much do I need to take of a substance to achieve these things? And that is a very individual thing. A lot of effects, like some people might just be not prone to having certain effects at all, no matter what they take or how much they take. And other people might be like very sensitive to things, and you really cannot know until you start gently, mindfully, lovingly experimenting.
Yeah, it's very variable. But also the levels of intensity do roughly correlate with the dosage guidelines on Psychonaut Wiki. So
for some people, but not for me.
Yeah, so you can figure it out.
Would you ever try a psychedelic drug designed by an artificial intelligence?
Sure, why not?
Have you ever had a valid IQ test?
No, I haven't taken a valid IQ test, and I'm weirdly against it. I just don't really feel that information would be beneficial to me. I think in some areas of an IQ test I would excel, and others I would be way below average. I guess that's just being neurodivergent for you, but yeah, I have no interest in taking an IQ test.
What do you think started all of reality, and do you think it will all end, repeat, or continue?
I think that the universe will probably continue in a big cycle, and that's nothing but a hunch, because how could I possibly know?
Are you happy?
Most of the time. A lot of the time I am not, a lot of the time I am. It's highly variable. I'm happy with my life. My mental health is not always great.
What do you think is your greatest wisdom obtained by using psychedelics?
Probably the illusory nature of the separate self, which I think I've already talked about today.
Yeah, regarding the unity experiences. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any rituals for preparing to jump into an experience?
Tidying my bedroom. Tidy house, tidy mind is very important under the influence of a psychedelic, so I get my environment absolutely perfect. Then I put on some nice music and get all comfy and cozy. That's my main ritual.
Yeah, this asker says, part of my anxiety before going on a trip is a guilt that I shouldn't be doing it and that I'm wasting my time and putting myself in danger. At this point, do you ever doubt yourself before tripping?
I guess... Really, it's really hard for me to give pre-trip anxiety advice because I don't personally experience it in the same way that I notice a lot of other people experience it.
Yeah, I guess like you, in terms of being concerned about it being in danger or wasting your time, like doing psychedelics is not like sometimes you do feel like it's wasting your time and so you don't do it. But when you do it, it's at least in part related to your passion and your job. Mm-hmm. And then you've done it enough to be really well aware of how it affects you, and so you don't really feel like you're putting yourself in danger. Are you single, and will you be my GF?
Okay, multiple people ask me this question. No, I'm not single. I'm in a poly relationship with Emily, a hypnagoguist, and I'm polysaturated, and I will not be your GF. It's especially unlikely if you're a guy.
Are you transgender?
Okay, so... This is probably going to be the first and last time I acknowledge this on this YouTube channel. It's not a secret. I've spoken about it publicly on Reddit for years. But yes, I am MTF trans, AMAB, and I am also intersex. The puberty that I went through was very different from other people of my assigned gender to the point where I was basically bullied for it. And in regards to my gender, at least, not everything else, I pretty much just want to live a normal life. So it's never going to be a focus of this channel or something I'm particularly interested in talking about here.
Were psychedelics involved in your gender identity?
Yeah, so I think ayahuasca helped me realize that I'm trans. I tripped hundreds of times on LSD, And I've been repressing all sorts of gender dysphoria for a very long time. But it was ayahuasca that finally made me realize that, which is one of the reasons I consider ayahuasca to be one of the psychedelics that was the most influential on me.
Would it be more accurate to describe 4D as being able to see in multiple directions from a single perspective, or being able to see multiple perspectives in a single direction simultaneously?
Seeing one thing from multiple perspectives, I think, is how people often colloquially, I don't know if I said that word right. Colloquially refer to seeing things in 4D, although that's not exactly the mathematical or scientific use of the term. So yeah, seeing things from multiple directions at once.
How common are shivers and feelings of cold after taking any compound with N,N-dimethyltryptamine?
Pretty common. It's not universal by any means, but I know quite a lot of people that get thermoregulation impairment or shivers or feel very cold on DMT. It's common enough that I've seen it happen.
I get it.
To at least two. You get it as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You've seen me being like, and then I was like, "Ooh, I'm cold."
Okay, I vaguely remember that. Yeah, okay, so 3 people I've seen it happen to. It's not that uncommon.
How common are satanic-themed trips with pentagrams, Baphomet-like entities, and voodoo-like visuals?
I would say that they are probably very common among people who are interested in those kinds of things, but not that common among people who aren't interested in that kind of thing. People often see visuals themed around a kind of worldview that they find interesting.
How do you think psychedelic effects are influenced by our understanding of computers and technology?
Oh, okay. So, right, I did read this question. It is an interesting question. I imagine that psychedelics are quite heavily influenced by people's worldview in general. And if you view the brain as a computer, which in my opinion, it kind of just objectively is, then your experiences are much more likely to be computer related. I don't think a prehistoric person would experience things in those words though.
Can a DMT breakthrough equivalent happen on psilocybin?
Yes, there's nothing special about the DMT breakthrough in relation to other psychedelics, in my opinion. It can happen on psilocybin, it can happen on LSD. To me, it happens quite reliably on 2CE in particular. I find that 2CE takes me to a very similar place.
Do you think psychedelics could be used as a tool to perhaps get closer to understanding what consciousness is, how it generates, how it works, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're going to understand how consciousness works, you need to explore it from the inside.
What do you think Kaikion actually was?
Probably some ergot lysergamide or something, I don't know.
Do you think it was, do you think there's any substances today that are similar to it, or?
I guess the lysergamide category of psychedelics. I haven't researched this at all. I'm just digging into vague memories, disregard everything I say, etc. I think it was some sort of ergot lysergamide. A quick Google might prove me wrong.
I have always wondered what makes 5-MeO DMT different to regular DMT, and which one would you say is better? They're different. They're different.
They're different, so
yeah.
It's like saying which food is better than another food. You might prefer one to the other, but you can't...
Yeah, why is 4-ACO DMT different from NN DMT?
Yeah, so they have different receptor profile affinities. They affect different subsets of receptors in the brain to varying degrees.
Molecules are different shapes?
They are slightly different shapes. You know, DMT doesn't have an MEO on the 5 position. I think the main difference is that DMT is much more visual. 5-MeO DMT tends to not have any visuals at all. It tends to just make you go through ego death and experience the near-death experience white light equivalent, and is also much more strenuous or physically sketchy than DMT. I think DMT is much more benign than 5-MeO DMT.
Which one do you think is better?
In my subjective opinion, DMT, but that's a matter of personal preference.
NN dimethyltryptamine?
NN dimethyltryptamine, yeah.
What's the rule of thumb to know when you have taken too much LSD or not enough?
Okay, so if you're having a bad time, you've taken too much. And if you're having a disappointing time, you haven't taken enough.
That's the rule of thumb. Where may I find information about possession/incorporation under psychedelics such as in... Umbandim. Umbandim. Umbandim.
Yeah, we're mispronouncing this.
Okay, I'm afraid I do not know how to pronounce this. Such as in Umbandim, ritualized, controlled, and benevolent possession. Is Professor David Luke the only one to speak of it? Do Western psychonauts speak of that phenomena at all? Is it truly rare, or do psychonauts keep it secret when it happens, out of shame, fear, and then quit psychedelics? How could we know?
Okay, so the experience of possession by some sort of entity or spirit or whatever under the influence of psychedelics definitely happens with some amount of regularity. I've been tagging trip reports recently and I had to come up with an effect perception of possession in order to categorize those kinds of experiences. I also have one guy trying to contact me who's convinced that he is possessed by a DMT entity while sober, and I don't have much to say about it other than it definitely can happen. It's documented in trip reports, and no, it's not being kept a secret. What are you talking about?
Which drug do you think has the most interesting pharmacology?
Probably ibogaine, because it's a serotonergic agonist, like a psychedelic. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist, like a dissociative. And it's a kappa opioid agonist, like salvia. So it's a psychedelic, a dissociative, and salvia in one substance, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, they're going to say DXM because it's also kind of wonky.
A DXM has that would be my second choice in terms of an interesting pharmacology.
How do 2CB compare to other psychedelics?
So 2CB is often...
Other psychedelics. I guess the classics.
2CB is often described as a mix of LSD and a less powerful version of MDMA.
How would you deal with extreme focusing on death and the fear that you might die, either A, die as a result of the trip, I know this is highly unlikely, but it comes up with some people, or B, in fact, already be dead and currently navigating the liminal space between life and death in your psychedelic experience?
Oh my god.
These are some pretty common experiences that people can have.
Yeah, perception of death or delusion of death, thinking that you're dying, is very common under the influence of psychedelics, particularly if you're not very experienced with ego death. I don't really have any advice for it other than if it's a huge problem for you, maybe consider taking lighter doses.
Regarding the specific combination of a psychedelic and a dissociative, would you say there are any specific subjective effects that only happen when the two classes are mixed and not consumed on their own? Do you have any notable experiences with this type of combo or any other type of commentary about it?
So I don't think it results in any subjective effects that wouldn't occur on either one of the substances if taken separately. They tend to just sort of average out into one thing. Dissociatives can really take the edge off of a psychedelic, and a psychedelic can add much more color and complexity to the experience of a dissociative. My experiences with combining the two have been with LSD and MXC, and I remember it made the dissociative whole unbelievably vast and colorful and intricate in a way that it was not otherwise.
What are your opinions on the jester entity within DMT, LSD, and mushrooms?
I mean, I think it's an interesting archetype. The jester clown archetype seems to pop up in a lot of different cultures, and I don't really have any opinions on it aside from that. I think the idea of a trickster is commonly associated with the appearance of a clown or jester, and people are naturally undergoing the idea of experiencing a sort of trickster being, and then culturally attributing the jester/clown-like appearance to it.
Do psychedelics really help with addiction?
Yeah, there's plenty of studies on it. I'll flash some up or something, I don't know.
And later in the question they say, especially iboga and magic mushrooms, or is it just a temporary effect?
It can be just temporary, but it can also last long term. There's a lot of studies on this.
Yeah. What are your thoughts of MDMA seemingly losing the magic for individuals even without abuse, even with spreading out every 3 months, and what the possible causes for this could be?
So I've experienced losing the magic on MDMA, and my advice would just be to wait a long period of time, especially if nothing new has happened in your life and you're using it around the same people. The euphoria and feelings of love and empathy, you can kind of build a psychological tolerance to them. I would use MDMA around my friends, and we would all be, oh, I love you, man, you're my best friend ever. And then we do that a few more times, and then eventually it just kind of feels like you've gotten it out of your system. So it just becomes this weird, sketchy stimulant. But if you then wait a year, it comes right back again. So I think it's largely a psychological thing. There may be a neurological component, but I can't really comment on that because I haven't done any research on it.
What are your thoughts about inconsistencies regarding how different trips or even highs on the same substance can feel?
What are my opinions on it? I mean, it's setting is massively influential on the experience that you have, the mind state you're in, the location that you're in. The hallucinations that you experience can just be kind of randomly generated, so it's a luck of the draw. I think that setting has a big influence on trips, just as much so as receptor affinities, maybe not quite as much so, but yeah, I don't know, it's a thing.
How do brainwaves and brain areas activity change on psychedelics?
So my rudimentary understanding of this is that activity in the default mode network, which is responsible for sort of daydreaming and thinking, it's the restful state of your brain that you enter when you're just chilling or thinking about whatever. That part of the brain goes down. But then also the brain becomes much more interconnected under the influence of psychedelics. Regions start to communicate with each other that were not previously communicating with each other.
Due to the sometimes objective feeling realizations had on psychedelics about the true state of things, what recommendations do you have for psychonauts and curious travelers/seekers in relation to the subjectivity of the psychedelic experience?
So, I don't know if I'm misinterpreting your question here, but I think you're asking, when you have crazy realizations about how the universe works under the influence of a psychedelic.
How do you know if it's true?
So I would sober up first and try and analyze it with a skeptical and rational mindset, and definitely take into account that it's not likely that you can learn the true secrets of the universe by taking a hallucinogenic drug. You may learn some genuine insights, but not everything is going to be 100% true. So don't take it at face value. Analyze it critically while sober and over time.
Yeah, actually, reading it again, I think there could be a component here of even realizations that someone can have about themselves and their life. Like, we've definitely seen people, have some pretty extreme experiences and seemingly change as a person based on realizations that they've had in ways that perhaps won't last, might not actually be ideal for them. They might have realizations that feel very objective to them about who they are, but it could have just been the drugs.
Yeah, so I guess my advice would largely be the same.
Yeah.
Sober up and analyze it after the fact.
What are some psychological, philosophical, or perceptual,
Going through ego death can turn people into massive narcissists because they're like, I've been through ego death so many times. My ego is so much smaller than yours. You can't even comprehend how tiny my ego is. And it's just annoying and extremely obvious. I guess people refer to it as psychedelic narcissism. Another thing is I refer to it as McKenna syndrome. So psychedelics will kind of activate the part of your brain that is responsible for building bigger picture spiritual frameworks, bigger picture context for how you fit into the universe. And if you are not grounded in reason and rationality, those new ideas can often be completely irrational or crazy, and I would just... Our cat is going crazy. Should we do anything about it?
We can just put some text on the screen being like, cats.
Okay, cool, yeah. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, McKenna syndrome. So those theories or worldviews that occur out of using psychedelics can often be completely out of touch with reality, and I would just advise people to try and not believe everything that the drugs tell them at face value.
Weird question, but does masturbation change after DMT/psychedelics? Or does, your viewpoint change on it?
So it definitely changes during psychedelics. I don't know about after. I guess if you had...
HPPD?
I mean, I don't think HPPD applies to masturbation.
I have heard someone talk about having closed-eye visuals every time they orgasm after they started using psychedelics.
Yeah, I guess so. Generally speaking, masturbation isn't going to change after you trip. If you have some weird sort of mental anxious block or shame around the idea of masturbation, I could see it helping with that, but otherwise, not really.
Can you explain the experience of déjà vu in strong psychedelic experiences? Explain.
Okay, so are they talking about feelings of familiarity? Or it feels like I've been here before, man, when you're undergoing a deep psychedelic experience?
Well, in our classification system, we have that separated from déjà vu, which is like, I feel like I've done this exact thing before.
Yeah, I mean, I would categorize déjà vu as kind of almost a time distortion or a memory encoding glitch in the present moment is being tagged as a past experience, even though it isn't. But there is also a component of the psychedelic experience where it feels deeply familiar, like you've been there before, and they're probably quite likely referring to that. And I guess my theories behind that are that it's a memory encoding thing, like déjà vu, that it feels familiar because you are experiencing an innate part of your subconscious that you did genuinely have some sort of a connection to.
What do you think of the idea, many people, that ideally everyone should experience psychedelics?
So I think that a significant percentage of the population should experience psychedelics, but there are plenty of people that probably shouldn't. For example, if schizophrenia runs in their family history quite prominently, and I don't think everyone should be using psychedelics. For some people, it's bad for them. Psychedelics aren't for everyone, and I think it's silly to say that they are. They aren't a miracle cure, and they can make things worse for certain types of people, even though they are immensely helpful for most people.
Due to the community generally choosing to relate to the subject as being either a complex mental or physical reaction or a spiritual opener of sorts, do you find it hard to compile information that is not of your own experiences? Should information be one side or the other with a disclaimer, or left up to the interpretation of the reader/viewer?
Okay, so I think he's talking about materialistic bias in maybe trip report analysis or subjective effect content. I do have some thoughts on this. So in the past, the subjective effect index, or I guess it still is the publicly available one, is heavily biased towards classifying things as delusions or definitely not true. And in the more recent iteration of the subjective effect index, I'm trying to be more ontologically neutral, as Daniel Ingram, an author who I've spoken a fair amount to, put it and has encouraged me to do. And I think that makes the most sense. So, for example, I would no longer class telepathy as a delusion of telepathy. I would classify it as a perception of telepathy. Because even though I don't believe that genuine telepathy is happening, I'm just here to document the subjective effect. My personal commentary can happen elsewhere, such as in videos like this.
You've talked about what you call McKenna syndrome in the past, as in the sort of manic, I have this crazy idea that I need to share it with the world thing. Do you think this is something worth going through and or beneficial to an individual or society?
I think it greatly depends on whether the person has some sort of a rational grounding in their worldview. If they don't, it can just sort of send them off the rails and they'll go off on the deep end and start believing in really intensely new age stuff and conspiracy theories and things like that. Otherwise, I think it can be a really good catalyst for creativity. So yeah, it just varies from person to person.
Yeah. At what point does CBD/THC use become psychedelic, or is it just the user set and setting, dosage?
So THC is a hallucinogen. It's not a psychedelic. It falls under the umbrella category of hallucinogen, just like psychedelic dissociative delirium and all the and the atypicals. But there's no dosage at which it will become a psychedelic. There's a dosage at which it will become hallucinatory. If you really push it, I wouldn't really recommend it, to be honest, with THC, because it's really anxiety-inducing at very high levels. Yeah. But yeah, it's not going to become a psychedelic at any level, although people often say that it becomes a lot more psychedelic after they have tripped many times, but that's more a result of their HPPD more so than anything.
Yeah, I think I've heard people talk about that specifically with LSD. Like after doing LSD, the weed becomes a lot more visual for them. I was pondering what your opinion is on psychedelics in relationship to self-development. Is it a core of one's development in the more spiritual aspect, or is it an addition?
So, I think that for the majority of people, they'll never truly know themselves unless they have at least a few good psychedelic experiences. Terence McKenna referred to it as going from the birth to the grave without ever having sex. It's roughly equivalent in its significance. So I think that psychedelics are extremely important for self-development, even though I don't believe that they are for everybody.
What effects do you suspect might differ between an autistic person and a neurotypical person? And if someone is autistic, should they abstain from the substance in its entirety?
So I seem to have clinically significant amounts of autism. Surprise, surprise. I don't really think it makes that much of a difference.
Yeah, it's like a relatively recent realization.
Yeah, I knew one autistic person that could get sensory overload much easier under the influence of the psychedelics, and I'm now, just right now, wondering if that's why 5-MeO-DMT causes me too much sensory overload for me to want to push it to ego death. But for the most part, I think psychedelics are just as helpful for autistic people as neurotypical people, and
all other mental health components being equal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like as long as they're not also schizophrenic. For example.
Right, but yeah, that would be a different thing entirely. Autism isn't not a bad thing when tripping.
Yeah,
I don't think it makes much difference.
If you were a person with no experience in psychedelics, would you consider the subjective effect index or trip reports as a spoiler, or is there an inherent novelty in the experience itself that cannot be conditioned by any information?
So I wouldn't consider it a spoiler, because I think it's actually more beneficial to know what you're getting into. I think you can navigate things much easier if you know what's going to happen, and it makes the outcome more positive, and you have more context for understanding and describing your experience. So I think considering it a spoiler is kind of silly, but what was the... is there an inherent novelty in the experience itself that cannot be conditioned by any information? Yeah, so I would say that you can't truly understand the psychedelic experience by reading the subjective effect index or watching replication videos on YouTube, and that you have to experience it yourself. But I would also say that that's true with literally any experience. You can't really know what it's like until you undergo it yourself, because words are inherently reductive and do not capture the experience itself.
I do think there's it is more dissimilar from non-psychedelic experiences than other things. So it can be kind of easier to explain to someone what something non-psychedelic is, whereas people have a lot less frame of reference if they've never tried it before.
Right. I would agree with that.
My question is about integration of psychedelic experiences. How do you go about that? Have you seen it go well or poorly? If so, why?
So generally for me, integration seems to just kind of happen automatically. I don't seem to have any problem integrating experiences, so it's hard for me to give advice. What I've heard from other people is writing a trip report can really help, taking some time to analyze what you went through, taking some notes, just really consciously thinking about it, and then also not tripping again until you feel like you've integrated your previous experience. But that's about all the advice I can give.
And I guess by integrated, in this case, we mean have reached a level of comfort with what happened and feel like you fully understand what happened insofar as you remember, I guess.
Yeah, you've analyzed it and thought about it.
Yeah. I guess it's based on the usage that I see. I think just some different people might be using the term integration a little bit differently. I guess processing it is most of what we're talking about.
Is there a difference between processing experience and integrating it?
Possibly to some people.
To me, they're basically synonyms.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's just...
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen it go well or poorly? That kind of implies that there's something else there.
I have seen it go poorly. Usually when people have a bad experience and it traumatizes them and they don't understand what the hell happened to them, and they are in just a state of trauma for a prolonged period of time afterwards. Very common with 5-MeO-DMT for some reason.
An example of an experience you've had regarding pantheism?
Yeah, so realizing that if the definition of God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator and sustainer of existence, and then realizing that the universe itself meets that same definition, and then realizing that, whoa man, the entire universe is God, and so is everything within it, and so am I, and so is everyone else. That experience generally comes up every time I go through Unity. Standard stuff.
Can you talk about your opinions on how to take psychedelics routinely in a healthy, responsible manner?
Don't use them more than once every 2 weeks. Start at a low dose, work your way up incrementally as you feel comfortable. If you're not done processing a previous trip, wait until you trip again, and take things like set and setting into account and do your research.
And like 2 weeks in between is kind of like a bare minimum. For a lot of people, it might be more of a once a year, twice a year, every other month. Like different people have different intervals that make more sense for them for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
What are your opinions on the extended DMT research to map the space?
I think it's interesting. I'm skeptical that prolonging the DMT experience is necessary to map it out. I think the returns might not be as significant as people would expect just by prolonging the experience. It's essentially, they're doing studies where they're using IV solutions of DMT to explore it for prolonged periods of time. And I think that's a really worthwhile pursuit. I'm a little skeptical, but I'm also excited to see what comes out of it.
Can psychedelics help with feeling burnt out? I have thoughts on this one.
I don't really have any thoughts on this one, so you can just answer that.
Okay, so my thought about this is potentially, but I think there's equal potential for the psychedelic experience to make you realize that you just do not want to do this thing that you're burnt out on anymore, and might even make it more difficult to continue.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Do you think mushrooms solve problems or just present them to people?
The latter, definitely. I think they show you what your problems are, and they can give you a conclusion on how to solve that problem, but that isn't enough to solve the problem. You have to put that into action after the experience. So many times, myself and other people that I've known will be tripping there. All my problems are solved now. Wow, this is amazing. And then they come down and they don't do anything about it, and they're still the same person. So definitely the latter.
Yeah, they're a tool, not a complete panacea or whatever.
Yeah, not a miracle cure.
Yeah. How do you think psychedelics becoming a deep part of our youth culture once again will affect society moving forward?
So I think it will help a significant percentage of the population break free of cultural assumptions, such as the system being good, or capitalism being good, or the environment not really mattering, or other people not really mattering. Standard counterculture stuff like that. I think when there's a certain threshold of the population taking psychedelics, that those kind of effects will play out exponentially. I don't think it will be enough to solve social problems just by itself, though, but I think it will be a huge help.
Do you think that psychedelics will one day be as mainstream as SSRIs for the professional treatment of anxiety and depression disorders?
In some places, yes, and in other places, I think there will be a lot of pushback.
Does taking acid frequently help developing dementia, Alzheimer's, or amnesia?
I suspect it might, but I have not looked into this at all.
What does it mean, help developing dementia?
So I think they're talking about things like neurogenesis helping to prevent...
Well, helping to develop it or helping to prevent it?
Helping to prevent it is
okay,
how I
okay,
interpreted
okay.
that question.
Probably, yeah.
I think that increased neuroplasticity would be likely to help prevent dementia, but I don't think psychedelics are just going to completely prevent dementia from happening.
Maybe like add some percentage points likelihood.
Yeah, I mean, even
one of many factors.
just having an active lifestyle instead of watching TV all the time is correlated with lack of dementia because you're keeping your brain stimulated. And I suspect that psychedelics would keep your brain very stimulated. So I think it would help, if nothing else.
Yeah. I know nothing of psychedelics. I'm wanting to try DMT and also sometime LSD. Which would you tell me to try?
I don't know, man. a very low dose of DMT, because it's like 10 minutes. Just make sure it's a threshold dose, and then you can experience the equivalent of a moderate LSD trip that only lasts 5 to 10 minutes. So you're in, you're out, not a big deal. You can go about your business afterwards and then decide whether or not you like psychedelics from there. But basically just whatever's available to you. I don't really think it matters. Safely. Yeah. You're not going to know which one you like best until you try them, and I can't tell you which one you're going to like best because it's down to the individual person.
Oh my God, the cats. If a person only had one chance to try a psychedelic, presumably any psychedelic, which one should they take?
I guess I would say mescaline, ayahuasca. Probably mescaline or ayahuasca. Yeah, those would be my choices.
Any channels that you would recommend which teach about spiritual growth?
Dreg.
I'm not sure if that's spiritual
JJ
growth.
McCullough. I don't
growth.
watch any YouTube channels related to spiritual growth.
Okay.
Sorry.
These are just general channel recommendations, not spiritual growth.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have video game and drug pairing recommendations?
Google Street View on an Oculus Rift is really cool.
On what?
On dissociatives. I think video games are actually more immersive on dissociatives than they are psychedelics in a lot of ways. I remember really enjoying Galaxy Wars on the Xbox 360 on LSD, but that was so many years ago. I don't know if that game is even still available anymore. Super Mario Galaxy on the Nintendo Wii, pretty great. Honestly, it's hard to say. Any game where you can sort of run around in a sandbox environment, Minecraft can be pretty good, especially if you're in creative mode and you can just fly around. Sandbox games are what I would recommend for tripping.
What neurotropics do you use and can recommend?
It's pronounced nootropics, to whoever sent this comment. Yeah.
I spelled it right.
Yeah.
I pronounced what they spelled right.
Right, yeah, you're good. Modafinil is my favorite one.
Isn't that a controlled narcolepsy medication?
I mean, yeah, but it's a nootropic.
Okay.
It's a nootropic. Modafinil and armodafinil are my favorite nootropics. I'm going to say that much.
We like NAC.
Yeah, NAC is good too.
Yeah, we like NAC. Memantine.
Oh, shit. Yeah, memantine is great. It's like a mild dissociative combined with something like modafinil that lasts all day. Big recommendation for memantine.
Yeah, but keep it low dose.
Yeah, definitely.
If someone was looking to substitute using stimulants at parties, what other psychoactive substance shows promise for being a good social drug?
Kratom. I think kratom is the best alternative to alcohol that I have found. It's very sociable, it's very stimulating, it's very euphoric. It's great in that kind of environment. It's not too overwhelming, you're not going to get out of control or anything like that.
It can be addictive, so don't use it frequently.
Mm-hmm.
In true nothingness, what is there to stop nothing from spontaneously becoming something?
I have no idea. I mean...
Well, it sounds like your thought on how the universe probably happened is that it did spontaneously become something.
So I think that something arose from nothing because there is a system in place that means that opposites presuppose each other, and you can't have nothing about something, and one day something will give way to nothing because it will go back the other way around and the cycle will repeat. But why is that system of interdependent opposites in place at all? We can't answer that. It just pushes the question back, so it's not true nothingness because that system is there.
Yes, what I was about to say. There is no true nothingness without true somethingness as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I probably couldn't tell you.
How do you handle death?
I mean, you don't. You just you just die.
I guess it could be death of people that you care about or whatever.
Oh, you don't handle that either from personal experience. You just grieve.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then eventually you mature enough that you can handle the grief, but it never really goes away.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on consciousness? Keep it short.
That is such a broad question.
I know.
I could not argue this in a philosophy debate, but I think that consciousness is similar to awareness, and that awareness is similar to responding to input, and I think that consciousness is sort of a gradient that goes all the way down from single-celled organisms up to human beings or beyond. I see no reason why an artificial intelligence couldn't be conscious. I don't think it's a property that's special to the human brain. I think it's something that just arises from any system that takes sensory input and then thinks about that and responds to it.
What do you think the meaning and purpose of your life is?
To describe what it's like to trip balls.
Do you believe that consciousness is universal across all beings?
I guess I just answered that. Yeah, I think that animals are conscious. I think that we probably give them less credit than they deserve when it comes to how conscious they are. I think that all living things are conscious to a degree. I think it's a spectrum.
With all your experience in psychedelics and altered states of consciousness, do you believe in an afterlife? If so, what kind of afterlife?
I don't believe in an afterlife. So I think that if the sense of self as being separate is an illusion and that you are identical to everything in that way, then when this body goes, everything continues, and that's a sort of afterlife in a sense. But at the same time, I think that's largely just semantics and how you define the words. I think it's philosophically justifiable, but it just depends how you interpret the meanings. I guess psychedelics often do give me this feeling that all time frames, past, present, and future, are occurring simultaneously and eternally, and that we therefore will continue to exist within the time frame that our life occurred forever, even though our life does not stretch out over the entire time frame. And from what I've researched, that seems to line up with how modern physics interprets time, but I'm not a physicist, so I couldn't really argue that with any sort of academic rigor. It's literally just what ayahuasca told me.
Do you believe that birth and death are transitional?
Yeah, I feel like by definition.
Cool. Am I God and the only person who is conscious?
Probably not.
Why do you believe in free will?
I don't believe in free will. Where did you learn that nonsense? I think that free will is an illusion and that we are all mechanistic, walking biochemical systems responding to sensory input with pre-programmed responses, and that cause and effect pushes all systems in this universe, and that humans are no different.
What are your perspectives on God?
I think pantheism is cool. I don't believe in an anthropomorphized God that's separate from the rest of the universe. I think that's quite silly.
What correlations do you find between realizations experienced under the effects of and the ethos of the currently existing religions?
So it seems to me that if you are a Christian, for example, and you take a psychedelic, you may well meet Jesus. But if you're not a Christian, then you're much less likely to meet Jesus. If you believe in ancestors and spirits, you're very likely to see those sorts of things while tripping. Some people have experiences with encounters with religious deities that they did not previously believe in, and they then come to believe in that religion and start following that religion, but that doesn't seem to be that common. I think that psychedelics can amplify your religious worldview. At the same time, though, they can easily just tear it apart and stop you from believing it altogether.
Okay. What are some safety guidelines you would recommend for psychedelics?
I feel like we've already talked about this.
We're in the safety section now.
Do your research. Google stuff extensively. Find all the materials you can online about a given psychedelic. Psychonaut Wiki, REUPLOAD, TripSit, those are all great resources. Look up dosage guidelines, look up safety guidelines, start at low doses and work your way up incrementally across many different trips as you feel comfortable. Don't jump into the deep end before you can swim, and take set and setting into account. Only trip in an appropriate environment and don't do it more than is necessary.
And test your stuff.
And yeah, test your stuff. That's good practice.
During the talk with Destiny, you said that doing MDMA more than once a year long term would likely damage your brain.
I don't think I said that. I think doing it more than once every 3 months would likely damage your brain. Once every year seems fine to me, to be honest.
Okay. Long term?
Once every year, long term? Yeah, I don't see it. I think people say don't do MDMA any more than once a month or once every 3 months. And while I think in the short term that's a perfectly acceptable guideline, in the long term, I think that would actually still be too much.
Do any psychedelics show signs of neurotoxicity or other negative physiological consequences, e.g. when microdosing?
I mean, I can't think of any that do that when microdosing because you're taking it in such a small quantity. But there are plenty of psychedelics that are physically sketchy. So some of the phenethylamines, for example, the DOX series can be pretty sketchy because they're so stimulating. If you did them at super high doses, you could go into cardiac arrest.
And bone.
Yeah, Embohm is a full agonist of the serotonin receptor, and that caused a lot of people to die.
Yeah, I don't
so
know that.
that seems to be bad. I guess AMT is like an amphetamine tryptamine, does some wacky stuff with serotonin and could be similar to overdosing on a stimulant, essentially. 5-MeO DMT can do similar things as well when taken in huge quantities, have weird cardiovascular effects and things like that, but I'm not too sure on the pharmacology of those ones.
Can I use psychedelic if I have tinnitus? Psychedelic causes tinnitus?
So, I don't think psychedelics cause tinnitus. They can make it worse. Stay away from DIPT because that's a purely auditory psychedelic that a lot of people report getting tinnitus from. But if somebody really wanted to take psychedelics and they had tinnitus, I don't think that should stop them from at least trying it. So, as I've said over and over again in this video, start at a very low dose, see if it exacerbates your tinnitus, and if it doesn't, press forward incrementally, and if it does, you can just stop. You don't have to keep going.
What are the safest psychedelic substances?
Probably the certain categories of tryptamine. So psilocin is very physically benign. DMT, extremely physically benign. LSD, which is a lysergamide, very physically benign. There are compounds within those categories that could be sketchy. Actually, I can't think of any really physically sketchy lysergamides. No, LSA is a really sketchy lysergamide because it causes vasoconstriction. Yeah, I think I've made my point.
Cool. Why sometimes people getting overdosed on MDMA?
Because they're taking too much.
Too much drug.
They are overdosing. They're taking too much. And that's not good.
And why? Possibly because they wanted to roll.
Yeah, or they didn't weigh it, or they were just being reckless, or they were compulsively redosing. It's been known to happen.
Basically, I'm wondering about potential safety issues with HBWR and also from combining ondansetron and HBWR seeds. Also, I've had myself and a friend both get a slight twitch in one eyelid that persisted for several weeks after use. This was without ondansetron.
Okay, so HBWR seeds are Hawaiian baby wood rose seeds, which combine LSA, which I just mentioned a second ago. And I really don't like LSA for me personally. It causes intense vasoconstriction, as in your arteries constrict, and it feels very tight, especially around the legs and kind of the wrist area. And it's bad and very uncomfortable. And that's probably why your friend got a weird, twitchy eyelid. As for combining it with ondansetron, that's just an anti-nausea medication that blocks serotonin receptors in the gut. I don't think there'd be a negative combination there, personally.
I thought we heard something about ondansetron being less benign than we originally thought.
Maybe, but his friend was getting the effect without doing ondansetron. I think the...
Well, OP and their friend were both getting it from just doing the HBWR. Maybe HBWR isn't the right thing.
I think the main culprit here is probably the LSA, more so than the ondansetron. I'm not a doctor. Disregard everything I say.
What are your recommendations for psychedelic use to people who have experienced manic/psychotic episodes?
Tread lightly.
Have a sitter.
Have a sitter. Keep antipsychotics on hand.
Low dose.
Low doses. And don't jump into the deep end or anything like that, because it can definitely exacerbate those symptoms. My advice generally, if you're really prone to psychosis and mania, would be to not trip. But I know not everyone's going to follow that advice. So if you are going to do it, just be very careful and take a lot of precautions.
Like, if you're going to do it, probably don't do it. If you're still going to do it, do all of these things.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about Salvia divinorum? We've already talked about it in the video.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a bit more.
And have you ever mixed it with DMT?
I haven't mixed salvia with DMT, but I had one friend who would mix salvia and DMT, and he would swear that DMT really took the edge off of the salvia, which I thought was a funny thing. Salvia I've done a lot. I went through a period in my life of doing it on a daily basis, but these days it just kind of scares me because it's so disorientating and confusing. I think it's the most bizarre experience a person can go through, and I think it's just as powerful as DMT, but in a completely different way. It's not a psychedelic, it's not a dissociative, it's an atypical hallucinogen, and it typically results in people separating from their bodies and having these bizarre interactions with entities and machinescapes and becoming inanimate objects is really common on salvia. For some reason, I've experienced that so many times.
Can you try to describe your most intense salvia experience? I think you may have already done it in the video about the machinescape stuff. I don't know.
I haven't done a video about machinescape stuff.
No, sorry, in this video
that
we're making right now.
I don't think I described a particular experience.
Oh.
Okay, so my most intense salvia experience is hard to actually put into words because it was so incomprehensible, but there's actually a video of somebody narrating this particular trip report that I wrote, and I'm just going to flash it up on the screen now, and you guys can go check it out if you want.
Are hypnagogic and/or hypnopompic hallucinations considered sober tripping?
Depends how you define tripping, but I think it's kind of analogous. You experience hallucinations during hypnagogia and hypnopompia. Hypnagogia, for those who don't know, is the state between being awake and falling asleep, and hypnopompia is a state between being asleep and waking up, and that's often when most hallucinatory imagery can occur. It's kind of like a sober trip, depending on how you define trip.
I honestly, I disagree. I think it's honestly kind of bullshit when people say like, oh yeah, you can trip without drugs, just like rub your eyes and you'll see like dots.
Right, okay, so...
No, it's to me, tripping is mental. That's
okay, it's similar
that's my
to certain hallucinatory components of a trip.
Yes.
Okay.
Does it replicate certain visual effects? Yes. Is it tripping? No, for me.
Okay, I mean, I don't disagree with that.
I mean, again, that would be like saying like, ooh, tripping. I've literally seen people say that. Okay. Why would one use external substances when they can just clean up the diet, use the breath, humming, and one's own internal alchemical system?
It's a good question. Laziness. Not everyone has the time to clean up the diet and use one's own internal alchemical system. We're living in a capitalist hellscape, working jobs and stuff. My alchemical system needs a deep clean with something that's faster. I can't, i.e. a psychedelic. Not everyone has the time for that. Some things are done for more convenience and expediency.
We just want the easy way out, basically.
Yeah. I feel like I'm getting increasingly snarky the further into the set of questions we get. I apologize for that. We've been going for hours.
Yeah. What do you think of people claiming to be able to have psychedelic-like experiences without the use of substances at high levels of meditation and spiritual practices?
I think it's possible, but I think it requires so much effort and training that it simply isn't practical for the vast majority of people.
And again, we have heard about people going through mental breaks from doing meditation, and so it has some of the same risks of psychedelics, as it turns out.
Yeah.
At least in some cases. Do you think one can attain ego death without psychedelics?
Definitely. There are all sorts of things that can cause ego death. Dissociatives can cause ego death. Salvia can cause ego death. Meditation can cause ego death.
I think they're probably talking about without drugs at all.
Without drugs at all? Meditation
can
meditation. Cause ego death. Just extreme experiences in general can cause ego death. People have all sorts of transpersonal and mystical experiences while sober.
Or near-death experiences.
Definitely.
Do you think that some people have easier access to these experiences sober, and do you think such people will have more intense psychedelic intoxication effects / experiences through substance use? Yeah.
There's lots of people that have sort of the psychedelic experience more accessible to them. It's like they're closer to it. Their brain just naturally leans more in that direction. They don't need as high of a dose. They'll start tripping on random combinations of drugs that aren't usually psychedelics. It's definitely a thing.
What would you say to someone who sees use of psychedelics as the easy route, or someone who thinks it's a superficial endeavor?
I think they're elitist and need to get off their fucking high horse.
Yeah, maybe they should meditate some more and,
tame down that ego a little bit and stop being so judgmental, because there are different paths to similar things, and it's up to the individual what they want to choose.
Yeah, not everybody's going to have the difficult route available to them for a variety of reasons. What age should a person be to start safely using psychedelics? Okay, so
I'm going to tread lightly here. I personally started using psychedelics at 17. I think that the legal limit to use psychedelics should be on par with that of alcohol. I think that just makes sense. That's how they're handling it with weed. It's just the same age as alcohol. And I think, generally speaking, it's safer to start using psychedelics when you're an adult.
Yeah, I think that probably the ideal age would be around 25. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a problem to start earlier than that, but if I had to name an ideal age, that's what I would say personally.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I could see an argument for that. I think it was beneficial for me to start earlier.
Yeah.
But if you had to, like, average out all people, maybe 25 is a good time.
Yeah. Do you know anything about how psychedelics affect underdeveloped, more plastic brains, such as teenagers or young adults?
Not really. I haven't looked into any research on it. I think that teenage brains would be more malleable in ways that could be better or worse. So I think it's much more of a gamble. And I think for that reason, people should tread more lightly when it comes to using psychoactive substances while their brain is still developing in general.
Yeah, that's why I say 25, because that's at an age where most people their brain will be more settled.
Yeah.
Do you think they should teach kids in school about drugs and pharmacology in general?
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, people should understand things about...
Yeah, and harm reduction practices, things like that. I could only see that being a good thing, just like sex education.
Well, I mean, like, America has messed up sex education before.
Yeah, and that's bad.
Yeah. But, yes. If there's no trip sitter around, should a tripper try and find one through the net, someone you trust to trip sit you through the internet?
I mean, if you really want a trip sitter, I suppose it could be better than nothing, but I don't think it's entirely necessary. And there's a real gamble with having someone through the internet, and there's not really as much benefit as they can bring, because it's just going to be a voice and video chat. There's no physical presence. They can't bring you a glass of water or try and, like, direct you into a different room if you walk elsewhere. So at that point, I would probably just recommend tripping alone on a lower dose.
Or just, plan your stuff better and just have someone you trust out there.
Yeah, but what if you have no friends at all?
Why do you have to trip? Well, I guess, like, no friends at all.
Some people...
well, like, you should find some friends.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. How would psychedelics fit within today's modern worldview, especially in correlation with traditional pharmacological practices? So it's saying the way that people think about how to take care of themselves and treat themselves and use medicine and stuff, how would psychedelics fit in that?
Okay.
And then what would exactly have to change from the public view and internally in the medical community for the further positive impact that they bring? So how would people have to change their views on drugs, and how would the medical community and the pharmacological community have to change things to further positive impact of psychedelics?
Well, I've already forgotten the second half of the question, but for the first half of the question, I feel like ketamine clinics have already kind of built up a model that would perfectly fit for psychedelic therapy within psychiatry. You have a clinic that you go to, there's a trained professional, it's a safe environment, and you have your experience there with a therapist that guides you through. So I think that things are probably just going to kind of lean into that direction. I've been in communication with psilocybin clinics and stuff in Oregon, and they seem to be adopting a pretty similar model. So I think there's already kind of a framework to have that happen. As for the second half of the question, what would have to change?
So how would the views of the public and the views of the medical community have to change for psychedelics to be integrated into society?
Well, I mean, they would have to accept that they are therapeutically beneficial, and then people are going to have to push for the legislature to allow those things into the medical system. That's kind of a broad question. I don't really think I have specific answers for, since I'm not politically involved or wrapped up in big pharma or anything like that.
Yeah, the fear-mongering must stop, though.
Yeah, definitely.
Any opinion on the immunosuppressive effects of some arylcyclohexylamines?
Arylcyclohexylamines. It just rolls off the tongue.
Arylcyclohexylamines.
Yeah.
Hexylamines.
So this question was asked by Penumbrium, and I feel like he probably has a better answer for it than I do. It seems like there are studies that suggest that certain aryl cyclohexamines, which are the class of dissociative that ketamine falls under, certain ones have antibiotic effects, which can be sketchy because it's like overusing antibiotics, which is really bad for your immune system. I haven't looked into any of the studies for it, but it does sketch me out a little bit. I certainly haven't noticed anything from occasional use of dissociatives like DCK in the way that I would notice from using antibiotics. It doesn't feel any different to me than a regular dissociative, and it's my understanding that if there is an antibiotic effect, it's incredibly mild, but I don't have a formal opinion on this at all.
Why do some people not experience any visual effects under the influence of psychedelics, even at extremely high doses?
So, visual effects seem to vary from individual to individual pretty dramatically. Some people are very prone to visual effects and some people don't get them at all, especially if they have aphantasia. If you do not experience any visual effects, I would recommend looking into aphantasia. Can you visualize things in your mind's eye at all? Because most people can, but some people can't. And there is actually an online psychoanalysis tool form thing that can put you on a sliding scale of how well you can visualize things. I was talking to Android Jones at a art gallery event several months ago, and he told me that he doesn't get any visual effects from psychedelics at all, and he has aphantasia, which was very impressive considering how amazing his art is. But it just seems to be a thing that a lot of people have. It varies from individual to individual. I've noticed that some people that get less visual effects get more auditory effects, but that's not always going to be the case. It's just a lot of individual variance.
Okay. Every time I do DMT, it's the same, but the first time I ever tried it was way different than now. Is that normal or no?
I think that's pretty normal.
Yeah, it sounds like probably like a psychological tolerance.
Yeah.
If I had to guess.
So my first DMT experience, I broke through very easily, and I don't get hallucinations on DMT nearly as often since then, so it felt like kind of a change. But I guess there's a certain uniqueness to your brain just suddenly being flooded with a drug that it's never been exposed to in that quantity before.
And to be clear, by hallucinations in this case, you mean like seeing actual like images of things as opposed to geometry, which you still get on
Yeah,
DMT.
yeah, I always get geometry. I do not always get hallucinations, which I would think of as entities, beings, places, scenes, stuff like that.
So then we have a couple different questions about taking very high doses of psychedelics and having minimal or no effects.
Okay.
And any advice to try to fix that?
Yeah, okay, so we've got a lot of questions like this saying, I took absurd amount of psychedelic substance and I didn't get any effects from it at all, or the effects are very mild. I definitely didn't blast off, I didn't go for ego death, anything like that. I don't have any specific advice. Increasing the dosage kind of becomes impractical at some point. Tom Ray, the founder of the company that I work for, is convinced that some people have a mental block on psychedelics and that they need to combine it with THC in order to get it to work. He says that's something that's very true for him, that psychedelics just don't work for him unless he also combines it with weed. And while I don't think that's true for everyone that has trouble getting effects from psychedelics, I think it's probably true for a lot of people, so that's an avenue that's worth exploring. Also trying different psychedelics and different dosages of psychedelics. I think you just need to do more exploration. Individual tolerances vary so much.
Yeah. Like for me, 4-HOMET doesn't work that well. 4-ACO-DMT is great.
Yeah.
Because I'm a difficult to get high person.
Yeah, Emily has a super high tolerance, and I have a pretty low tolerance.
Like, I don't think I'd be mostly functional on 18 grams of shrooms like this person.
18 grams of shrooms would destroy me.
It would get me a lot.
I would just pass out for like 10 hours, probably.
I would definitely be more functional than you would be on it, but that would still be a lot for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the last question, wasn't it?
That was the last question.
Oh my god. How long did that take? Holy shit, we've been doing this all evening. I think it started at like 7.
What time is it?
So, this video is definitely getting demonetized, so if you want to support my content, our content, please go to patreon.com/Josie Kins and sign up. Gives you access to my semi-private Discord server. And yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks everyone. Bye.